The Lion's Cross-Species Baby by Mary T. Williams. A romancely.com story. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more free paranormal romance audiobooks. Blurb. A Lion Shifter, Paranormal, Pregnancy Romance Novel. Sometimes you can't help but be attracted to people, no matter how much you want to deny it. When lion shifter Cooper and owl shifter Annie meet up at work, sparks immediately fly. Both assumed their time together would be a no-strings-attached type of fling. Little did they know that their connection would take an unexpected turn when Annie discovers she's expecting a child. An unexpected pregnancy is always a shock. But this isn't just a normal pregnancy. It's going to be a forbidden cross-species baby. Will Cooper and Annie find a way to make their relationship work while dealing with a complicated pregnancy? Or will tragedy strike them first? Get answers in this paranormal owl shifter romance book by Mary T. Williams. Chapter 1. Annie lugged the suitcase to the bed and lifted it. The damn thing was empty and still weighed a ton, Annie thought to herself, grumbling. What concerned her was getting it through the airport and then to her final destination in Brazil. Her insides squeezed, nerves and excitement had been battling for supremacy within her for the last month. She'd received her acceptance letter from the museum the month before and had been preparing for this trip since. As a history major specializing in ancient cultures, the opportunity to visit a dig in Brazil that may or may not have found an as yet unknown civilization was a gift from the gods. Annie had poured her trust fund into the trip, requesting a rushed passport, doctor's appointments to get any immunizations that might be required, and so much research about that area of Brazil she could practically recite the entire history of the region. As she packed her delicates, she silently thanked her best friend's husband once more. Mark had pulled a few strings with his nephew, Cooper, who worked for the museum and was actually in charge of the dig. The man, who Mark said was a fantastic dude, had only agreed because Mark was his uncle. Because of the reluctant agreement, Annie had decided to be above and beyond well prepared for this trip. She wouldn't embarrass herself nor Mark with any lack of knowledge. She opened another drawer as Chloe, Leah and Mark's daughter, scampered and followed closely by her best friend, Leah's dog, Jenny. Annie paused in her packing to listen to Chloe's pattering, none of which she understood clearly. "You don't say," Annie exclaimed when Chloe stopped talking, waiting for her response. Chloe, naked as usual, nodded wisely and gestured to Jenny, rambled on for 20 seconds, then shifted into her lion form abruptly. Annie laughed, now she understood. It bothered Chloe that she could shift but Jenny could not. "Chloe, you know Jenny doesn't change. She's always a dog." Chloe shifted into her human form again and grinned at Annie. She tilted her head at Annie and waited again. "I'm sorry, sweet girl, I don't have time to shift right now." Chloe stared at her and made a whining sound in the back of her throat. Jenny whined with her. From the moment Leah and Mark had brought Chloe home, Jenny had, in her doggy way, appointed herself guardian over the little girl. When Chloe was sad, Jenny was sad. "I'm sorry, my love. But I promise I'll shift with you tonight after dinner," Annie promised. Chloe giggled. Leah rushed in at that moment, saw her daughter, and clutched her chest. "There you are. Chloe, you've got to quit running off." She looked at Annie. "And when did she learn to open locked doors?" Annie's eyes widened, and she glanced at Chloe. "I didn't know she could do that." "You're in trouble, you know?" "Yes, I do know. I'll have to install locks at the top of all the doors," Leah grumbled. She picked up Chloe and playfully patted her cheek. "Young lady, what am I going to do with you?" Chloe wiggled to be set down after kissing her mother's cheek. Leah shook her head and placed her on her feet. Chloe shifted again and took off, Jenny following closely. Annie laughed when Leah fell into the chair in the corner. You look exhausted. I'm always exhausted, Leah said. Shifter babies have so much more energy than normal babies. Who told you that? I read it in one of those books, and you know Chloe and I go to the mommy/baby yoga with human babies, shifter babies, and halfies, Leah reminded her. Halfies? Annie asked with a snort. That's what half-human, half-shifters call themselves. Isn't that funny? Leah laughed. Anyway, I've compared notes. Chloe only sleeps 5 hours in 24. Human babies sleep 10 or more. She's going to make an old lady of me. Annie smiled. Leah said things like this all the time, but she wouldn't trade her life for anyone's, and Annie knew it. Leah watched her for another moment before rising. I'll be back in a sec. I better go find Chloe, Leah said, leaving the room. Seconds later, Chloe, in lion form, pounced into the room with Jenny, and the two of them began to wrestle. Leah, they're in here again, Annie called. Leah returned, exasperated, and closed the door. Maybe with the door closed, I can help you for a bit. You can just sit and watch and keep me company, Annie told her. Leah needed to rest more than Annie needed help with packing. So have you heard from Cooper at all? Leah asked. He emailed me so I could send him my flight information and arrival time. He's going to meet me at the airport because, according to him, it would cost a fortune for a taxi to take me to the dig, if the driver could even find it. Annie began going through her closet, trying to determine what she would need and what she wouldn't. She would be there for nearly a month. Cooper Downs. Such an interesting name. Sounds like someone famous, Leah mused, her novelist's mind working. Then she bit her lip. I'm so worried about you going down there, Annie. Annie rolled her eyes, but not so Leah could see. She had lived with Leah since her parents and sister were killed in an airplane crash. And Leah had always been a worrywart. Leah, I'll be fine. Cooper has been there for 2 years. I'll only be there for a month collecting information for my thesis. Don't get all feminist on me, but it's different for a man in a place like that, Leah commented. You sound like an old lady. I guess Chloe's work is done, Annie laughed. Leah rolled her eyes and laughed as well. If Cooper is anything like his uncle, I think I'll be more than fine. Don't you? Leah nodded in agreement, a silly grin on her face. Yes, my husband is amazing. I doubt Cooper is that awesome, but he must be close since they are related. Oh, good Lord, Annie murmured. You're making me a little sick to my stomach, Leah. You're just jealous, Leah sniffed. Then she shrieked, Chloe! Get down! Annie looked around. Chloe, in her lion form, had climbed the drapes to the top and was tiptoeing across the rod holding them up. Chloe roared at her mother, a cute baby lion roar that was more adorable than threatening. As Leah rushed over, Annie put her hand over her mouth to quiet the laughter escaping, although unsuccessfully. Jenny added to the general melee and racket by barking at Leah as she tried to reach her daughter. As Annie watched, Chloe shifted into her human form and immediately lost her precarious balance. Leah caught her easily, put her on the ground, and began lecturing her about how dangerous her behavior was. Chloe sniffled twice, then opened her mouth and wailed in protest. Jenny, sensing her best friend's distress, began to howl. Annie shouted over the noise, I'll probably die of a heart attack here faster than something happening to me in Brazil. Leah glared and pointed a finger at her as she lifted her daughter in her other arm. You'll be so bored in the middle of the forest with no Chloe to keep you on your toes. Annie pretended to consider. You're probably right. But my ears will be grateful. Leah stuck her tongue out at Annie, and Chloe mimicked her. Annie threw her head back and laughed so loudly even Jenny stopped whining. Annie stepped closer to Leah and Chloe and playfully flicked Chloe's nose. "Why don't you and I go play for a bit, cutie? I think your mom needs a rest." Chloe stretched her arms out to Annie. Leah gratefully released her. "Where are you going to take her?" "I promised her we'd shift together and play tonight. Instead, we'll go now and you can take a nap." "A nap?" Leah asked, confused. "I can't really remember what that is." Annie laughed again. "We'll go outside. But don't worry, Mom. Between Jenny and me, we should be able to keep her safe." As Annie hauled the girl out the door, she called back, "You're just lucky she isn't a bird of some sort when she shifts. You'd never be able to keep her under control." "She'd be in a giant bird cage," Leah called as she marched to her bedroom. "And don't think I'm kidding." She snapped her door closed. Annie nuzzled Chloe's neck, smiling. "Don't worry. She used to make threats like that at me, and she never followed through." As soon as she stepped outside, she put Chloe on the ground and shed her clothes. She shifted into her owl form and perched on the step closest to Chloe, who squealed with delight and pet her head. Jenny sniffed her as if she didn't recognize her, something she'd done since they brought her home. Annie hooted at her, then at Chloe, who shifted and shot off the porch. Annie soared up into the air, flying low and keeping a close eye on Chloe's tan form. 2 days later, Mark, Leah, and Chloe drove Annie to the airport. Annie's nerves were on fire. She had traveled before and knew her way around the airport, but she'd never gone alone. Her family walked her to the security checkpoint to say goodbye. Leah held her in a hug for a long time. When she pulled back, she had tears in her eyes. "I know it's only for a month, but I am going to miss you so much." "I'll miss you, too, Leah." "Call when you land, and email as often as possible," Leah ordered. Annie had explained to Leah that emailing wouldn't be possible all that often. She would literally be in the middle of a forest. She had no idea how often excursions to town happened, but 2 weeks had passed between emails from Cooper. And forget about phone calls. "I'll do my best," she promised, hugging Leah again. She turned to Mark. "Thanks again for helping me. If you thank me one more time, I'm going to tear up your ticket," Mark told her as he slung an arm around her shoulders for a quick squeeze. "Just be careful." He pulled her away from Leah. "I know it's going to be nearly impossible to send a message once you're there, but try your best to send at least 3 while you're gone. Otherwise, Leah will drive me completely nuts." Annie laughed. "I'll find a way, I promise. I know how she can be. And she's even worse now that she's a mom." "Worse about what?" Leah asked, eyebrow raised. "Nothing," Annie and Mark said together, innocent smiles plastered on their faces. With a smirk, Mark hugged his wife with one arm and grabbed the escaping Chloe. "Chloe and I are going to see the planes so you two can have a minute to yourselves. Annie, be careful, be safe." Annie kissed Chloe once more on the lips and cheek, nuzzling her. "Goodbye, sweet Chloe. Kiss Jenny for me." Chloe nodded her understanding and patted Annie's cheek. She babbled to Mark about planes, and they moved off. Annie shook her head. "I swear, sometimes she acts like she's 5 and sometimes she acts her age." The pair of women watched Mark walk away with his daughter in his arms. Leah smiled. "Yes, for a 1-year-old, she's quite advanced, but that's normal for a halfie." That word again, Annie laughed. Leah's face was serious when she spoke again. "Annie, I'm serious. Please be careful. You don't know what it's like in South America. All the drugs and cartels and murders. Leah, it's not 1975. Pablo Escobar has long since passed, Annie giggled. You don't think a million others have taken his place. And besides, he was in Colombia, not Brazil. You don't know who is in charge there. Leah, you watch too many movies and documentaries and whatever. I'm going to Brazil as a history major, not a DEA agent. I'll be fine. Please stop worrying before you have an aneurysm, Annie said. Leah took a deep breath. You're right. I'm being a little silly. Leah pulled Annie into a hug. I love you so much, Annie. You are my sister, even if we aren't blood. Annie blinked rapidly to clear the tears threatening to fall. Damn it, Leah. I didn't want to cry. Leah smirked. Well, it's true. I love you and can't live without you, so you better get your ass back to America in 1 month or less. I will come get you. Yes, Mother. Annie kissed Leah's cheek, lifted the handle of her rolling luggage, and headed to the security check. She looked back once. Leah lifted a hand to wave and blew her a kiss. She returned the gesture and faced forward, refusing to let the tears fall. She'd only be gone a month, not forever. Her adventure was about to start. Almost 9 hours later, Annie walked into the airport in Rio de Janeiro, exhausted and exhilarated by the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells, and she hadn't even left the airport yet. Much like the airports in the US, Rio's airport had lines of people from all over the world, tax-free shops, and kiosks with all sorts of foods. Security was a little more lax here, so she was able to wander around after retrieving her bag from baggage claim. Annie had overestimated her time of arrival. She'd told Cooper her flight would be in at 4 o'clock, but they'd landed at a little before 3. She pulled out her cell phone and turned it back on. She made the promised call to Leah and swore she'd send an email before she left Rio if she could. Leah's main concern was the fact that she would be alone for over an hour. Leah, seriously. I'm in a crowded airport surrounded by people, Annie huffed. She was irritable from the flight. Not people, Annie. Strangers. Just keep an eye on your personal belongings as well as any food or drink you buy, Leah advised. I will, Leah. Listen, I'm starved and I can smell Brazilian food and I think it's calling my name. All right. Love you and be careful, Leah said over the phone. Love you too. Annie disconnected and sighed with relief. Leah was wearing her out with all this worry. When she turned on her phone, 6 text messages had popped up from Leah asking about her progress. I know she loves me, but geez, Annie thought as she began her meanderings through the airport in search of the delicious smells. Near the exit, she found a kiosk selling a thick stew that had black beans and what looked like sausage in it. The vendor explained in broken English that it was called feijoada, a traditional Brazilian stew. Annie bought a bowl and a bottle of water, and the vendor also gave her a thick slice of bread to sop up the juices. She found a small table, scooted her luggage under it, and sat down to her meal and people watching. The feijoada was very spicy, and Annie finished her bottle of water right after the last gulp of soup. She dragged her luggage out from under the table and walked back to the kiosk for another water. When she turned around, a family had taken her table. She sighed and looked around. A rather uncomfortable bench sat close to the exit, and since it was almost 4, a seat near the exit wasn't such a bad idea. At 4:30, Annie was still sitting on the bench, finished with people watching as her irritability changed to anger. She glanced at her watch again, for the 5th time in 5 minutes, and wondered what she should do. She mentally reread the email from Cooper. She was positive she'd told him 4 o'clock, he was 30 minutes late and she had no way to contact him. Another 15 minutes passed, and she was so angry she was almost in tears. Fear played a small role in her need to cry, but she fought the tears. She checked her watch again and began debating with herself about finding a hotel for the night and trying to contact him tomorrow. She had no idea where the dig was located, so she couldn't even hire a driver to take her there. A man sat down on the bench next to her and smiled when she looked at him. She nodded at him, not in the mood to muster a smile. "Is everything all right?" the man asked in heavily accented though perfect English. "Fine, thank you," she replied brusquely. "Did your ride forget to pick you up?" "How did you guess?" she replied rudely. His face showed his shock, and she sighed. "I'm sorry for my rudeness. I'm very irritated. He is almost an hour late." "Your boyfriend?" he asked, glancing at her ringless left hand. Annie looked at him again. He seemed harmless and was probably just hitting on her, but she was in a foreign country and had to be careful. "Yes, but I may have not adjusted for the time difference." She had, but he didn't need to know that. "If you need a ride, I am more than willing to take you anywhere," he offered generously. Alarm bells sounded in Annie's head. "No, thank you. I'll wait a while longer and then get a cab if necessary." The man leaned closer to her. She could smell his breath, a combination of sweet and sour she found unpleasant. "A beautiful woman like you, and a shifter at that, should never be left to her own devices." Annie stood abruptly. "Excuse me." She grabbed the handle of her bag and marched away from the man and the exit, a little frightened. Before she was 10 feet away, a man's voice called her name. "Annie! Annie, I'm here!" She stopped walking and looked back. She had seen a picture of Cooper, and she wasn't sure this was the same man. His beard had grown out in the wilderness, and his blonde hair was shaggy. But the eyes were the same. She'd been drawn to the eyes, the color of pine leaves, even in the photo. Relief swept through her, then anger. She marched over to him and hissed, "Cooper, you have to pretend to be my boyfriend so pervert guy over there will leave me alone." Her dramatics sounded ridiculous to her, but she was angry and tired and a little scared. She wasn't thinking right. Cooper glanced at the man on the bench, who watched them with the eyes of a predator. Cooper sniffed the air and recognized his shifter scent. "A werewolf," he murmured to Annie, "Brazilian werewolf. They're very dangerous." Annie's eyes widened. She'd read accounts of the werewolves here. They weren't civilized by any means, and there were no laws here to keep them under control. "Just get me the hell out of here, please," Annie growled at him. "He knows I'm a shifter and offered me a ride." Cooper looked at her again and sniffed. Her owl scent was intoxicating to his senses, and he tilted his head and looked at her. His smile broadened. Loudly, he said, "Babe, I'm so sorry. Please don't be angry." Annie was tempted to curse at him. "Whatever. Just take me to the hotel." "Of course, babe, of course." "Let me get your bag," Cooper gushed. He took the handle from her, his hand briefly on top of hers before she snatched it away. "Aw, babe. I said I was sorry for being late." Annie glared at him. He might be acting the part, but I'm really pissed, she thought. "Can we just go? I'm tired of being here." "Your wish is my command, my love," Cooper said, taking her free hand and leading her out. Chapter 2. Once they were out the door, Annie jerked her hand out of his. She fell back a couple of steps to follow him rather than walk next to him. Her anger was clear in her face and in her steps, almost stomps. Cooper frowned, his face turned away from her. Bad way to start a friendship, he thought to himself, and now he'd have to make it up to her somehow. Mark had not told him about Annie's beauty, only that she was a shifter and wanted to do her thesis over ancient Brazilian civilizations. Cooper had been excited to have a student at his dig, someone he could teach and share all the fascinating findings he dug up with his team. The men he worked with here were merely laborers, not interested in the artifacts themselves but in the paychecks digging for them brought. They reached the Jeep, and Cooper opened her door for her so she could slide into the passenger seat. She did so without a nod of thanks, her anger almost leaping off her to punch him in the gut. He hefted her bag into the back of the Jeep and walked around to the driver's seat. As he started the car, he said, "I'm really sorry about being late. We made a find today and I was so excited time slipped away." Annie sniffed indignantly, but her desire to know about the find overcame her anger. "It's fine, I understand. What did you find?" "It's amazing!" The excitement in his voice was palpable and catching. Annie's heart beat a little faster. "So what is it?" "Annie, you won't believe it until you see it," Cooper told her. He slowed to turn onto a blacktop road. "By the way, this is the last blacktop road you will see." Annie's patience, already thin after her altercation with the werewolf, stretched even further. Through clenched teeth, she said, "That's terrific, Cooper. Tell me what you found." Cooper smirked. "We found a set of cave drawings." "Really?" "Oh my God!" To an untrained person, cave drawings didn't sound very exciting, but to a history major or archaeologist, this was exciting news. "What are they of? Where did you find them?" "While we were digging earlier this year, we found an underground cave with several artifacts. The entrance had caved in, and I don't know when the last human was in there, but let me tell you, I'd bet all the money I have it was several thousand years ago." "How fascinating," she exclaimed, then hummed to herself. "You know, I may have to alter my thesis a little now that I'm hearing this." "Wait. It gets better," he teased, looking at her with an eyebrow wiggle she found adorable despite her resistance to like him. She smiled. "How does it get better?" "The drawings are sexual in nature," Cooper baited. "Sexual?" Annie asked, frowning. "But no one has ever found cave drawings of a sexual nature in Brazil or South America. Not that I've ever read about." "Exactly!" Cooper declared, triumph on his face. "This is the first archaeological dig in South America to find cave porn." "Cave porn!" Annie laughed, shaking her head. "Is it brazen?" "Oh yeah. Looks like something you'd find on a bathroom wall," Cooper told her with a laugh. "I can't wait to see it." Annie was nearly bouncing in her seat. She turned to look at the window and gasped. "Wow. Beautiful." The blacktop road had slimmed down to a narrow, paved pathway through a rainforest. Up ahead, she could see where the pavement ended and the road became just dirt. The trees around them, tall as skyscrapers, were so green her eyes hurt to look straight at them. Several monkeys followed their slow progress through the verdant forest, their eyes round and curious. "What breed of monkey is that?" she asked, pointing out the window but not averting her eyes from them. "They're adorable. Those are Capuchin monkeys. They're cute but very cunning. Be careful if one joins us in camp," Cooper warned. "Are there a lot of animals near the campsite?" "More than you'll ever see," Cooper told her. "We maintain a loose watch to make sure no predators come close, but overall the animals leave us alone." "How badly has the dig disturbed their habitat?" Annie was a historian, but she very much lived in the present. The idea of destroying a habitat to find evidence of the past was, to her, appalling. "We didn't have to do much clearing, actually. You'll see." This road leads directly to our camp. The dig is a bit of a hike through the forest, about 1.5 miles, Cooper informed her as the Jeep hit a deep dip and bounced hard. Whoa, sorry about that. We have a road, but it's not in great shape. Annie nodded and returned to study the land, hoping for another glance at some animals. She almost decided on vet school rather than history, but when she'd volunteered at a clinic, she discovered that most animals were skittish around shifters. After a bit of research, she realized that she wouldn't make a successful vet because her patients would shy away from her. So history had been her choice. How much further? She asked. Only about 3 miles, but it'll take about 20 minutes because of the road conditions, Cooper said. She nodded, her eyes glued to the view outside her window. He glanced at her, admiring her profile, and hit a pothole so big it nearly took out a tire. Damn. Sorry. No worries, she replied, although she'd bumped her head against the window and hoped he hadn't noticed. Mark told me you were a shifter, but not what you shift into, he hinted. She looked at him and winked flirtatiously. You could smell that guy and tell he was a werewolf. Why don't you smell me and guess? Cooper looked at her, a look of interest on his face. Challenge accepted. Give me your arm, please. Annie extended her arm to him, and he took it with one hand and held it to his nose. His eyes remained on the road as he breathed in her scent. His brow furrowed, her scent was unfamiliar to him. He moved his nose to the crook of her elbow, and she squirmed when he breathed. He glanced at her. Ticklish? Annie chuckled. Your breath on my elbow tickles, yes. She took her arm away. So you've smelled plenty. What am I? Cooper pretended to think. Let me see your arm again. I didn't get a good enough sniff. Annie shook her head but extended her arm so he could smell. He concentrated on her wrist this time, smelling thoroughly and sensually. Annie felt a warmth growing in her body. Her squirming was from arousal rather than tickling. He looked at her, slowing the car but not stopping. He knew the effect he was having on her, and he was feeling the same thing. He dropped her wrist and smiled knowingly at her. I have to admit, Annie, your scent is unfamiliar to me. Really? I should have made a bet with you, Annie laughed. I shift into an owl. Oh wow. I would give anything to be able to fly. So many beautiful sights to see, Cooper said, admiration clear in his tone. It is magnificent. Are you a lion like Mark? Yep. Our whole family shifts into lions, Cooper told her. King and queen of the jungle. An impressive animal, indeed, Annie commented, returning her attention to the jungle around her. Do you have the opportunity to shift much here? I shift every night, Cooper told her, for exercise. Annie opened her mouth to reply, but her speech was arrested by a sight she hadn't expected to see. A panther ambled across their path, followed closely by a cub. She gasped as Cooper slowed the Jeep and stopped before getting too close. They watched, without speaking as it continued on, the cub batting at its tail until the mother picked it up by the scruff of its neck and disappeared into the forest. Magnificent, Annie breathed. They are, Cooper agreed. You're lucky. In the 2 years I've been down here, I've only seen a panther with a cub 3 times. This is the 4th. Just wow, Annie said quietly as the Jeep continued moving. They reached the campsite 10 minutes later without any further interruptions. Annie, who wasn't accustomed to a campsite, frowned at the accommodations. There were 2 campers, although she was pretty sure neither had electricity or water, and 4 tents around it. A picnic table and makeshift grill stood off to the side of both, and some tarps set up on stakes offered the only shelter for what she assumed was their kitchen. How many people are on the site with you? 5, including me. 6 now that you're here. Buddy is the other archaeologist. That's his camper over there. The other guys stay in the tents, Cooper told her. Did you bring a tent? I wasn't told I needed one, Annie said, her frown deepening. Will I need to go back to Rio to stay? Oh no, that's too far away and the road isn't in good enough condition to travel out here every day, Cooper said. I told Mark I'd share the camper with you if you were comfortable with that. Is that my only option? Annie realized how rude that sounded when he looked at her with a raised eyebrow and climbed out of the Jeep. She climbed out as well and met him. I don't mean to be rude, Cooper. I just didn't realize I'd have to share. I would have brought a tent so as not to inconvenience you. It's no inconvenience, Annie. You'll be more comfortable in the camper, he told her as he lifted her bag out of the back of the Jeep. It's safer, for one, and though not air-conditioned, it provides protection from the bugs and such. Annie nodded. Yes, okay. Thank you. You're most welcome. Cooper took her bag and led her to the camper. Annie followed him towards the camper, looking around her. Her mind was in a whirlwind. She had felt an attraction to him and sharing a camper with him may not be a good idea. She wasn't here to find a boyfriend, she was here to do the research for her thesis. I will not succumb to my arousal, she told herself. Cooper opened the door to the camper and let her enter first. It was more spacious than she had expected, with a division between the living area and sleeping area. Cooper watched her look around, her face passive. It's not much, but it's home for now. Annie looked at him. It's not bad at all, actually. Better than the hard ground under a tent. Absolutely. It sleeps too back there, but I'll let you sleep there and I'll take the bed out here. There's a bed out here? Annie asked, looking around suspiciously. Cooper chuckled. There is. The table changes into a bed. Oh, I don't mind sleeping out here. There's no need for you to change your routine, Annie offered. If Mark found out I made you sleep out here, he'd kill me, Cooper laughed. Besides, it's no less comfortable out here than in there. Or maybe I should say neither is very comfortable if I'm telling the truth. They laughed. Cooper moved past Annie, intentionally brushing his body against hers. He might not have recognized her shifter scent, but he had picked up on her pheromones. She had been aroused when he had sniffed her arm. He had smelled it in the subtle change in her scent, and he had seen it in the goosebumps that had pimpled the skin on her arm, skin as soft as silk. I'll leave you to freshen up a bit. We don't have running water, but we keep jugs for drinking and different jugs for washing. He pointed out which was which. When you're ready, come out and we'll hike over to the dig. If you're not too tired. Won't it be dark soon? Cooper glanced at his watch. We've still got an hour. We could wait if you want. No, I'd love to go out today, Annie assured him. I'll leave you to it, then, he said with a smile. He left her alone, and as he walked across the campsite to see if anything from breakfast was left, he thought about Annie. He was definitely attracted to her, that was for sure, but would it be prudent to seduce her? He hadn't been laid in so long he wasn't sure if he remembered how, but getting her underneath him would bring it all back, he was sure. What would Mark think if I seduced her just for my own pleasure? He wondered. He knew Mark was close to Annie, which caused the second thoughts. His decision was made. He wouldn't seduce her, but if she continued the flirting and obvious arousal, he would let the relationship take its course. If she wanted him, she could have him, but he wouldn't pursue her. Damn, he thought. That's going to be a hard rule to live by with that beauty just a folding door away. Annie waited for him to leave, then released the pent-up breath into the air. Damn, he was fine, she thought. That blonde hair and gorgeous smile would win her over if she wasn't careful. She reprimanded herself for being foolish. He was just a man, like any other. She couldn't let her hormones rule her behavior while in Brazil. She would focus on her thesis, and that was it. She vowed to put Cooper Downs and his raw animal magnetism. She giggled at her joke, out of her mind. 10 minutes later, she exited the camper and looked around for Cooper. She saw him munching on some kind of fruit as he meandered her way. He held it out to her. "What is it?" she asked, hesitant to eat anything she didn't recognize. "It's called jabuticaba. It's a kind of fruit." "What does it taste like?" she asked, looking at the deep purple, juicy fruit. "It's kind of like grape juice. Sweeter than grapes by themselves, but that flavor. It's good. Try it," Cooper urged, holding a piece out to her. Annie took it from him, her fingers brushing his palm and sending a warm sensation up her arm. As she popped it into her mouth, she looked at him. The juice had exploded over her fingers, so she sucked on them. His eyes narrowed and did not shift from her mouth until she removed her fingers. He licked his lips as he watched her, and she saw the movement. Arousal shot through her again, and she looked away. "So which way to the dig site?" she asked, her voice a little husky with arousal. Cooper watched her for another second before speaking. He cleared his throat and swallowed the arousal that demanded he kiss her. "This way." He turned and walked away from her, and she followed quietly. What was that? She asked herself. She had deliberately taunted him, teased him by sucking her fingers. She griped at herself for breaking her rule in the first 5 minutes. If you aren't going to sleep with him, you can't tease him. Cooper introduced her to the workers at the dig site. His associate, Buddy Wilcox, an older man with graying hair and buck teeth, ran the dig when he was gone. The rest were men they'd hired here in Brazil. A nicer group of fellas you won't find, Buddy claimed, waving at the 4 men who worked on the dig. We're glad to have you, Annie. Cooper told me you're a history major here to work on your thesis. Yes. My emphasis is on ancient civilizations in the Americas. Ah, interesting topic, to be sure, Buddy said. I'm sure he told you about the cave drawings? Annie nodded. I'm so excited to see them. I bet. It's kind of dark, but we can take a flashlight down, Buddy commented. Cooper had a different opinion. Don't you think it's better to see them in the daylight? Well, it's certainly easier to see them in the daylight, that's for sure. But a quick peek with a flashlight won't hurt a thing, Annie interjected, smiling her most charming smile at the pair of men. Buddy laughed. Damn, I've missed having a woman around. She knows exactly how to get her way too. Annie laughed and said, I have some feminine wiles, it's true. Oh, I'll bet you do, Cooper commented, winking at her. She raised an eyebrow at him. Let's take her down. She won't give up until we do. No, I won't. I can also nag with the best of them, Annie proclaimed as she grabbed the proffered flashlight. The trio tramped to the opening of the cave, which was wide enough to walk in as long as one leaned over at the waist and walked slumped over. Annie, who was almost as tall as Cooper, bent at the waist and walked hunched and uncomfortable, for about 20 feet, descending the whole time. Once they exited the tunnel, she could stand up straight again. They'd entered a rough chamber that might have functioned as the home of a family. Archaeology markers set about the place showed where a tool or a bowl or something of that nature had been found. A trickling sound like water echoed with their footsteps, although Annie could not find any water. Annie lifted the flashlight and looked around for the drawing. When she'd located, she gingerly moved across the floor, avoiding the markers and generally watching her step. She didn't want to pollute their finds. She leaned in close to the drawings, studying them as closely as she could. She wondered why the men had claimed you could see them better in the sunlight. A breeze struck her face, and she pointed her flashlight up. Above her, a shaft went straight up to the sky, through probably 15 feet of dirt and rock. At exactly noon, the sun would be directly overhead and would send a ray of light directly on the drawings, lighting them up like museum-lit paintings on the wall. Finally, she turned her attention to the drawings. She tilted her head to the left, then to the right, examining the awkward positions of the two people in the drawings. There were 3 separate drawings, each depicting a couple having intercourse, and each depicting a different position in which to have intercourse. She chuckled. Behind her, Cooper grinned. He knew what she was laughing at, but he asked her anyway. "What's so funny?" Without looking at him or Buddy, she gestured to the drawings and said, "This is ancient Brazilian Kama Sutra." Latin lovers, indeed. Cooper and Buddy laughed loudly, their guffaws bouncing off the walls like basketballs in a gym. Cooper stepped up next to her and said, "What is so interesting to me is that you looked up and saw their skylight before you even bothered with the drawings." "I felt a breeze," she explained, then pointed at the picture. "Look at this one. He's taking her from behind." She moved a little to point at the next one. "And here, he's performing cunnilingus." I've read the theories on sexual practices during the time this drawing was made. There's nothing in that research to support this. "Ah yes, but those are just theories, my dear," Buddy said from behind them. "These drawings may just blow those theories out of the water." Annie's mind was spinning. Cooper and Buddy had made one hell of a discovery if they could prove the dates were accurate. "Have you dated this?" "We're in the process." "I know what you're thinking." Annie looked at him, pulling her eyes off the third drawing, which looked like a woman on her back, legs in the air, and a man holding them up as he fucked her. "What am I thinking? If these are dated when we think they are, we've made the discovery of the decade down here." "You're right," Annie said. "How are you keeping this quiet?" "I'm not reporting to anyone until I'm 100% on the date. And that will be after I lock in the publications in my name and Buddy's." "And you're willing to let me share this in my thesis?" Annie asked, concerned. Archaeologists were very stingy with their finds, unwilling to share in discoveries that could win them fame, tenured positions, and occasionally, large grants to continue working. "Of course," Cooper said, smiling at her. "Buddy and I will write our papers and be published, and you can write your thesis and graduate. You'll probably get a great position at one of the top universities after being in on this." Annie smiled, giddy. "Honestly, I'm just thrilled to be here. This is probably the biggest discovery I'll see in my lifetime." "You never know." "Very true." A moment passed as they stared into each other's eyes. Lust, strong and hard, was visible in them both. Buddy cleared his throat, interrupting what might have ended in a kiss. "Okay, guys, this is getting weird and it's getting dark," he said, a laugh in his voice. "Let's get out of here and get some dinner." Chapter 3. Annie frowned. What the hell was that? She thought. She was following Cooper and Buddy out of the rainforest and back to the campsite, the workers behind her. Because of the impending darkness, no one spoke. They were too busy concentrating on not tripping over anything or getting lost. So Annie had plenty of time to think about what had happened between her and Cooper. Not 30 minutes before she had told herself she wouldn't get involved with Cooper, and then that moment. Moments ruined lives, she grumbled in her head. She didn't want to have moments with Cooper, or anyone, for that matter. She had a life plan, and it did not include a man in it. But then she thought about how long it had been since she'd been with a man, let alone kissed one. Annie'd had a boyfriend throughout her undergraduate studies, a nice young man named Brandon. The two had dated for 3 years, and as consenting adults, had enjoyed the pleasures of the flesh often. She shivered as she remembered how good an orgasm could feel when a man knew what he was doing. Brandon had been her only lover thus far, and he'd been pretty damn good. But when graduation approached, they realized their lives were taking them far away from each other. She wanted to get her master's, and he had plans to start his career. They had broken up on amicable terms, and had even enjoyed each other the few times they'd been able to see each other. The last time she'd seen him had been over a year ago, and she didn't do one-night stands. She'd been celibate ever since. So she restarted the debate with herself over Cooper. Obviously he was interested in her, that look had been filled with lust. And the pull he had on her. Wow. She'd nearly leaned over and kissed him soundly on the mouth. Would he have returned the kiss? Hell yeah, he would have, she saw it in his eyes. And now she was wet and lustful. A little fling in the Brazilian rainforest wouldn't hurt a thing, she told herself with a grin. Lost in thought, she tripped over a root and called out. All eyes turned to her as she caught herself before hitting the ground too hard. Cooper returned and helped her back to her feet. Are you okay? Cooper asked, his hand on her upper arm. Annie's face was so red she was surprised it wasn't glowing. I'm fine, she muttered as she brushed her clothes off, just a little embarrassed. No need to be, Cooper assured her, his grasp steadying her. It's easy to fall here. It's a trail of sorts, just not a very good one. When he moved to release her arm, she took his hand in hers and smiled self-consciously. Would you mind? I'd feel better with someone guiding me. Cooper smiled at her bold move. He was no fool, she didn't need a guide. She'd felt the lust burning between them in the cave as well. Of course I'll hold your hand. But I should tell you, you don't play the damsel in distress well. If you know my game, why are you playing along? She flirted. I haven't played any game in so long, I'm not sure I remember how. But I'd like to try, Cooper told her. Looks like we're in the same position. I haven't played for a bit of time either, Annie responded. She turned to follow Buddy, who rolled his eyes at them and continued down the path. I wonder who will win. If I have my way, we'll both win, Cooper claimed, squeezing her hand tightly. Annie giggled. So tell me. What kind of food do we eat at the campsite? Ah well, about that, Cooper said, obviously uncomfortable. The food is pretty rough. Definitely not what you call fine dining? Annie frowned. Is it edible? Most nights. We mostly eat food straight out of the cans. Sometimes, when we're lucky, one of us will either kill or catch something for dinner. Otherwise, our protein comes from the canned meat or beans. Yum. Annie was grateful she'd had time to eat at the airport. Well, I didn't come out here expecting much. And I can eat just about anything as long as it fills my tummy. I think that's a shifter thing, Buddy commented. He'd been listening. Because this stuff tears up my stomach sometimes, but Cooper never has a speck of trouble. Maybe that's because I'm in my 20s and you're in your 50s, Cooper called forward. Buddy stopped and turned. Watch it, pal. I can take you no matter how old I am. He raised his fists in a mock boxing stance and imitated the cowardly lion. "Come on, put 'em up, put 'em up." Annie laughed and said, "I don't think we're in Kansas anymore." "Good Lord, I hope not." "Dreadful place," Buddy affirmed with a snort. Cooper leaned closer to Annie. "Buddy is actually from Kansas. Claims it's the worst place in the world." "Most boring is more like it," Buddy replied as they stepped into camp. "Go ahead and eat. I've got some food in my camper. I'll see you in the morning." He trudged to his camper, shutting the door decisively behind him. Cooper led Annie to the kitchen area and picnic table. He opened a locked wooden box and reached in to pull out cans of food. "All right, Annie, what'll it be? We can split the can of ham, and you get your choice of beans or peas." Thanks, but I ate at the airport," she told him, but her stomach gave a little rumble, disputing her words. She smiled. "I guess the walk was more exercise than I thought." "I'll take the beans." "A good choice, madam," Cooper said with a bow. He dug around in the box for a can opener and began opening cans. The other men had filed over and were digging around as well. As Annie watched, she began to understand how this worked. Each man got his own can of vegetables, and then a pair shared a can of ham. "How often do you go to town for supplies?" "About once a month." "I probably should have picked up supplies today when I went to pick you up," Cooper answered as he handed over her can of beans. "Regardless, we have plenty until it's time to take you back to the airport." "Why is the food in a locked box?" "Animals won't steal food they can't smell." "Ah, but you're making the assumption that we only have animals to worry about." Cooper sat down next to her at the picnic table. The other men had taken their food over to the fire pit, where one was kindling a fire for the evening. He followed her eyes. "The fire is actually for the animals. Most of them won't come near the flames." "But what did you mean about we don't only have to worry about animals?" Annie's voice trembled a little in fear. "There are a few tribes in the area. So far we've only seen them from a distance, and we've been here for 2 years. I really don't feel like they'll bother us, but I also don't want to go without breakfast because they decided to steal our food." "Are they dangerous?" Annie asked, concern in her voice. Images of small men in loincloths carrying spears with painted faces flashed across her mind. She felt a little guilty for the stereotype she'd learned from movies, but that's all she had to go with. "I don't think so, as long as we don't threaten them." "The men who work for us," Cooper indicated the men eating by the fire, "are from one of the tribes close by. They help us if we encounter any natives. They speak all the dialects in this area." "You don't speak the language?" "I speak Spanish and Portuguese, but I don't know the native languages," Cooper told her. "They've tried to teach me some of it, so I have a few words, but not nearly enough to keep us out of trouble." He took a bite of the cubed ham and asked around a full mouth, "Do you speak Spanish or Portuguese?" "I speak a spattering of Spanish and absolutely no Portuguese," she admitted, thoughtful. "I guess if I plan to spend time on digs like this I'll need to learn sooner rather than later." "You really should. It will help you tremendously when it comes to dealing with workers, especially deep in the jungle like we are." "None of them speak English?" Annie asked, gesturing again at the men. "One of them speaks a little, but not enough to communicate. They all speak a dialect of Portuguese, so that's how I communicate with them. They have to talk slowly sometimes, and I'm pretty sure they make fun of me," Cooper added, laughing around his peas. Annie smiled and lifted a spoonful of cubed ham to her mouth. The amount of salt could fill the ocean, but overall, it didn't taste bad. She'd seen cases and cases of bottled water, so that question had been answered. She walked over to the pile, grabbed one for herself, and brought one back for Cooper as well. The bottle was half empty before she finished her gulping. I think I've sweated every ounce of water out of my body since I've been here, Annie mumbled almost to herself. The humidity here is ridiculous, Cooper agreed. So now that we've eaten, I'd love to see you in your owl form. I bet you would, Annie giggled. Shifting was much easier without clothes. She had taught herself to shift slowly so that her clothes wouldn't rip, but it was a hassle and a little uncomfortable. Do they know you're a shifter? Yes. I told them the first day. Saves trouble if I have to shift suddenly, Cooper explained. So there's no weird prejudice or random voodoo religion thing? Where do you think you are, Jamaica? They laughed together. Jamaicans were known for their absolute hatred of shifters. Shifters weren't safe there. Many news stories had popped up about shifter sacrifices and such. That's a pretty awful joke, Annie said. But truth, Cooper replied. Ugly truth. Truth usually is. Annie eyed him, her smile sliding off her face as lust slammed into her with full force. She closed her eyes a moment and turned her face away. She knew her lust must be clear in her face and eyes. When she looked at Cooper again, he was smiling. I'll shift first, but only if you swear you'll shift, Cooper said. Annie looked at the fire. 2 of the men had disappeared into their tent, one was snoozing on the ground next to the fire, and the last had his back to her. He wouldn't see her if she stripped. They don't pay attention to the gringos, as they call us, Cooper said, indicating the men with a nod of his head. He began shedding his clothing. Annie's eyes widened. Before her was the sculpted David in the flesh. Every muscle was defined, his skin was flawless, but when he pulled his pants off, along with his underwear, the similarity to the famous statue ended. This man was more than well endowed, he was almost a record breaker. Cooper waited for her eyes to come back to his, a smirk on his heavenly face. Like what you see. More than I'll ever admit, she told him breathlessly. Now shift. He winked at her and shifted so quickly she was still looking where his human head had been. His mane, a dark brown, was wild and flowed over his beautiful head and down his neck and back. His coat, the tannish yellow of barley, was as flawless as his skin, leading her to believe the man had lived a charmed life. He sauntered over to her and rubbed against her, nearly knocking her off the bench she was sitting on. She laughed and ran her hands through his mane, catching her fingers in the tangles. If you'd like, I'll brush through your mane to get rid of these tangles, she offered. He looked at her, his human eyes in the lion's face, and nodded the huge head. When she began to comb her fingers gently through it, though, he backed away and stared at her. She grinned and tilted her head. "Aw. Not right now," orders the king of the jungle. "My turn." He nodded the great head and sat down on his haunches to watch her. Annie felt a little self-conscious as she removed her clothing. Briefly she contemplated shifting while dressed, but he hadn't. She had nothing to be ashamed of, she worked hard for the muscular body she possessed. Her skin wasn't as flawless as his because she'd been in a skirmish or two as an owl, and her childhood had been filled with mishaps that led to scars. But her breasts were firm and perky, her waistline small, her stomach flat, and her legs and ass were all muscle. Cooper made a noise in the back of his throat, nodding his approval. She rolled her eyes at him and shifted, flying immediately into the air. She circled the camp below her, making little hooting noises at the lion as she dipped close. His feline instinct set in, and he batted at her as if she were a cat toy. She hooted loudly at him, admonishing him for his claws, and he settled down. Once he was calm, she landed in front of him, and the two watched each other. Annie hooted quietly at him, and he made a soft purring sound. She launched up into the air again and landed on his back, clutching him gently with her feet. He liked the feeling, so he shifted around until she understood, and she walked up and down his back, digging her claws into his fur, scratching his back. He really began to purr then, and she hooted with delight. She grew bored of being in the owl shape if she couldn't fly, so she flew to her clothes and shifted again into her human form. He followed suit and watched as she put on her panties and t-shirt, but nothing else. "Why did you shift back?" "I get bored if I can't fly around," Annie shrugged. "I don't know my way around here yet and don't like to fly in unfamiliar airs." "That makes sense, I guess," Cooper said. "But since you're up so high, can't you find the location you're looking for?" "That's not the issue. I can find anything from the sky. I don't get lost," Annie explained as she gathered the rest of her clothes. He frowned. "Then what is it?" "I'm not familiar with what predators might be out and about." "You don't really have to worry about that, I guess." Cooper shook his head. He had gathered his clothes as well, not bothering to put any of them on, and gestured for her to precede him to the camper they were to share for the next 3 weeks. "No. Other predators in the animal kingdom leave lions alone. Our only enemy is other shifters and humans. The shifters who shift into birds don't fear many things, but in a new environment, you never know." "Always better to be cautious," Cooper agreed. They had reached the camper and stepped inside. Annie looked around and discarded her clothes on what was supposed to be Cooper's bed. She turned to look at him daringly. She lifted her shirt off her body and dropped it on top of her other clothes. Chapter 4. Annie lifted her head out of the bucket. She'd been throwing up for the last 30 minutes. She wondered if the food was having an adverse effect on her body, but she hadn't been sick until this morning. And it was only throwing up, nothing else. She frowned as she felt the need to vomit rising in her throat once more. As she finished her 4th round of dry heaving, she wished she was at home or in a hotel or anywhere that had plumbing. Throwing up was bad enough without having to do it in a bucket that must be emptied later. She rose and wiped her mouth with the cool, wet washcloth she'd taken from the cabinet and dipped in the basin. Grateful Cooper had been up and out of the camper when she arose from the bed. They had been sleeping together the entire week, and every night they had enjoyed each other's bodies, reveling in the sexual experiences. She knew everything about his body, how to touch him, kiss him, and make him feel the most pleasure. He knew everything about her body as well, but that didn't mean she wanted him watching her throw up. The vomiting extravaganza had ended finally, and Annie's stomach was calm. She brushed her teeth and dressed in a clean shirt before grabbing the bucket to dump it behind the camper. When she opened the door, she looked around before exiting and walking around to the rear of the camper to dump it. She didn't want to explain to anyone what she was doing, and luckily, everyone must have gone to the dig near the cave. She took the bucket with her with the intention of washing it out in the creek they walked past each day. She wondered briefly if somewhere up the creek there was a bigger section where they could swim. Research before coming to this country told her most waterways here, as long as they were moving, were safe for swimming, just not for drinking. Annie would give anything to be immersed completely in the water, and had mentioned it in conversation to Cooper, who'd had a twinkle in his eye when she'd made the comment. After swishing her mouth again with water from a bottle, she grabbed a tin of peaches and scarfed them down. She needed to get to the dig so she could take more pictures. She had a good start for her thesis, but she needed so much more and only had 2 weeks left in which to gather the information and pictures. Before leaving the campsite, she sat for a few minutes to make sure the nausea wasn't going to return. As she waited, Cooper bounded into camp, excitement written all over his face. "Annie! There you are," he said. "I thought you'd come in with the workers." "Yeah, sorry. I was working on something for my thesis and wasn't paying the least bit attention to time," she lied convincingly. Even if she hadn't been convincing, he was entirely too excited to notice. What's going on, Cooper? You look like a kid who just got the best Christmas gift ever. Cooper grinned. Even better. We found more drawings deeper in the cave. Annie's eyes widened in excitement as well. She grabbed his arm and said excitedly, "More sexual drawings? Or just standard cave drawings?" "Either way, that's fantastic." Cooper was nodding his agreement. "They're sexual in nature. It's just like you said. The Brazilian Kama Sutra. We're hoping to find even more as we continue to excavate." Cooper took off his cap and wiped the sweat from his brow. "I'll tell you, Annie, I thought this was a hell of a find before. Now I'm beginning to believe it may actually be the find of the decade." Annie touched his cheek with her hand. "I'm so happy for you, Cooper. Big things are coming." "Yes, they are." He grabbed her around the waist and lifted her off the ground. He swung her around in a kind of dance, laughing. She laughed with him until the nausea returned. "Oh, Cooper, put me down," she said. When she was on the ground, she covered her mouth with her hand and waited. He watched her, concerned. "Are you okay, babe?" He'd begun calling her babe the day after she arrived. The day after they had sex for the first time. Annie nodded her head and belched quietly behind her hand. "I'm okay, just a little nausea. I think the food is starting to get to me." "Oh, babe, I'm sorry. Why didn't you say anything?" "It's just a little nausea, Cooper," Annie said with a little smile. "Yeah, but now that I look at you, you seem a little pale," Cooper said, putting a hand on her forehead. "No fever or anything, though. And you certainly haven't lacked energy." Annie giggled. "Well, not in bed. Maybe you're wearing me out." "I kinda like that idea," Cooper said. His grin was so big she thought his face might split. "Oh good lord, your ego is so big I'm surprised there's room for anything else in that head of yours," Annie chided, turning to grab her cap off the table and pulling her ponytail through the hole in the back as she spoke. "Come on. I want to see those drawings." "Let's take the Jeep since you aren't feeling well," Cooper said. "You can get there in the Jeep?" Annie asked, wondering why they hadn't been taking advantage of that on occasion. "You can, but it takes about 30 minutes. We have to drive around several miles of jungle on a really crappy road to get there. That's why we always walk." "Takes less time," Cooper informed her. "Hey, we can walk. I don't feel that bad." "Like I said, just a little nausea," Annie assured him. "Let's take it anyway," he said to her. "It may be a rough ride, but the scenery is absolutely beautiful." Annie smiled. She had her camera in her backpack but would take it out if the scenery was half as beautiful as what they'd driven through her first day. She already had to take the memory card out of the camera and import the pictures onto her computer. It had been completely full of pictures. Luckily, out here in the sticks with no distractions, she'd been able to organize the photos into folders, which would make her life so much easier when she got home and really started working on her thesis. Cooper took her hand and led her to the Jeep. "Come on. I'm really excited to show you these pictures." Annie smiled at him, and he stopped moving and stared at her. She frowned at him. "What? Do I have something on me?" "No." "Then what is it?" "Your smile is so captivating," Cooper said, staring at her as the smile he was falling in love with appeared on her face again. She reddened and looked down. "And the way you blush, man." He stepped closer to her and put his arm around her, yanking her body up against his. "So, let's stay here and do dirty things to each other for the next 2 hours." Annie giggled and wrapped her arms around his neck, nuzzling him as he kissed her throat and hummed. What about the cave drawings? They aren't going anywhere. Cooper, control yourself, Annie chided, pulling away from him. He held her so that their bodies still touched, but they could look into each other's eyes. A minute ago you were bouncing out of your skin to show me those drawings. And now I'm coming out of my pants, Cooper said as he pressed his cock, still in his pants, against her pelvis. Annie's eyes widened. Oh Alala! What an interesting predicament you've found yourself in. She stepped away from him, dancing to the side when he reached for her. But it's going to have to stay in your pants for a bit longer. I want to see those drawings. Cooper sighed as if she was keeping him from a secret treasure, and to him, she was becoming a treasure he didn't want to let go of. He nodded and took her bag from her. Let me take this for you. Thanks. Please don't put it in the very back. I might want my camera, she said to him, her back to him as she grabbed a couple of water bottles. When she turned, he was holding the camera out to her. He grinned and said, You'll want it, I promise. The drive was bumpy and terribly uncomfortable for Annie, whose stomach began to churn as they hit bump after bump. She refused to be sick, though, and swallowed hard whenever she felt the need to vomit rise in her throat. Small sips of water helped, and she was grateful for the saltine crackers she'd found when digging in her backpack. They were a bit stale, who knows how long they'd been there, but they made her stomach feel so much better. She wasn't able to take any pictures. Every time she looked through the lens, her stomach lurched even harder and she felt like her esophagus might explode. This is not good, she told herself. Her mind threw articles she'd read at her, such as the bacteria that can grow in the water in South America. She reminded herself she'd only drank from the bottled waters, not from a stream or pool. She remembered an article about a voracious strain of food poisoning that had killed several shifters she'd read about. But that had been in Africa, not South America. Annie ordered her mind to stop the fussing. She knew she was being ridiculous, but she couldn't help it. She'd always been a bit of a hypochondriac, sure she had the worst disease imaginable when she coughed loudly. You're so quiet, Cooper commented. And you haven't taken a single picture. Yeah, I guess my stomach is still a little upset. I'm sorry. Want me to go back? Heck no. I can mull through a little nausea. I want to see those drawings, Annie assured him. Besides, I turned down a hot bout of sex with a hot dude. I'm not missing out on both. Cooper laughed. They're worth it, I promise. And the hot dude plans on fucking you tonight, so you'll actually get to do both. Thank the gods, she replied, sarcasm so thick in her voice he could almost cut it. I thought I had lost out on the hot dude sex forever by turning you down once. Too much for your ego. Shut up, Annie, he told her, reaching over to put his hand on her thigh and squeeze. I promise I'll fuck you for as long as you'll let me. Annie laughed and put her hand on top of his. Better enjoy it, friend. I'm only here for 2 more weeks. Annie's attention was arrested by a group of marmosets swinging on vines in the trees. She pointed, ecstatic. Monkeys! Cooper smiled at her when she glanced at him, her face so elated he thought he was looking at an angel. But when she turned away from him, his frown deepened. He had forgotten she would only be here for 2 more weeks. She had to go back to the United States and to school to finish her thesis. At that moment, bouncing in the Jeep with her, watching her face beam with excitement over monkeys, he realized he didn't want her to leave. How did I fall for her so quickly? He wondered. Because she's perfect for you, he answered himself. She's beautiful, can hold an intelligent conversation about anything and everything, is the sexiest damn woman he'd ever met, and she was a good person. He shook his head and glanced at her to make sure she was still enthralled by the wildlife. You went into this knowing it was a 3-week fling, he chastised himself. Stop being such a romantic. At the dig, they waddled down to the next room in the cave, which was much deeper and required electric light. The generator hummed like an overexhausted 18-wheeler, which ground on Annie's nerves as she listened to it. Even this far down, she could still hear its incessant noise. But the drawing took all her attention. She began snapping photos, asking Cooper to hold the light at different angles. Have you taken pictures? She asked. Only about 1 million, Cooper laughed. I'll probably have that many, Annie responded as she clicked 5 more in succession. This is one hell of a find. I know. Just think of the grants, Cooper said, shaking his head. How much longer do you think you'll be down here? I'm here 6 more months, if I wish to be. I'm going to continue this excavation in the cave, see if any more drawings pop up. If nothing else is found in 2 more months, I'll go back to the States and write the book. Annie smiled. Sounds fantastic. She frowned. Damn it, she cursed internally. She felt lightheaded. To stop the sensation, she put her hand on the wall and steadied herself. Cooper noticed immediately that she had stopped talking and was holding the wall. He watched her for a minute, trying to gauge exactly how sick she was. When she swayed, he stepped forward quickly and grabbed her arm. Hey, you don't look so good. Yeah, I think I need some fresh air. Let me help you, Cooper said, holding her around the waist and guiding her up. They had to walk bent over, which wasn't helping the lightheaded feeling. She took deep, steadying breaths and willed the black spots to go away. After an interminable walk, they reached the opening of the cave, and she plopped down on the ground right outside the opening. She put her head between her knees and took several more deep breaths to clear the stale air from the cave out of her lungs. Cooper brought her a bottle of water, which she downed in several large gulps. He watched her as she sat back, eyes closed, and seemed to meditate herself out of the sickness. She was pale but not sweaty, a good sign in his book. He could tell she wasn't 100%, but her color was returning and she was breathing more normally now. Feel better? He asked. He put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed. Then he touched her forehead. No fever. I feel better. That was so weird. I've never felt faint before. She frowned in consternation. Kinda sucks. Cooper laughs. Woman nearly faints, makes a joke. He shook his head. My kind of woman. Annie snorted. Your kind of woman is every woman. Ah, come on. I'm much more discerning than that, Cooper said, wiggling his eyebrows. Yeah, you're right. You did manage to get me, Annie replied, winking at him. Cooper watched her for a minute. She was joking and messing around, but she didn't feel good. And she wasn't hiding it well. Hey, listen. Why don't you and I head back to camp? You obviously don't feel good. You could lay down for a bit until you feel better. Annie rose to protest, but the wave of dizziness returned and hit her much harder. She wheeled a little and sat down hard on her ass. Holy shit. I must have vertigo or something. Cooper, who was usually calm, was getting close to panic. Have you had that before? No, but I've never felt like this before. Maybe we need to take you into Rio, see a doctor. Is that safe? Annie asked, her voice rising. Yes. I've been to the main hospital there. It's pretty much the same as a hospital in the United States. It's a major metropolitan, after all. They even have a Starbucks, he told her. More than one, I'll bet, Annie murmured. I think I'll just wait. Let's see how I feel tomorrow. If I feel this bad, I'll go into Rio and see someone. I'll take you, if you want. Can you give me directions? I paid pretty close attention on the way out here, Annie claimed. Cooper chuckled. You were staring at the animals and trees. Whatever, Annie said with a small smile. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Okay. Let's head back, then, Cooper said. He offered his hand, and she took it. He helped her up slowly and held her as they walked to the Jeep. Damn, I feel like a baby, Annie grumbled. I hope the guys aren't making fun. They wouldn't make fun of you. They all think you're gorgeous. Oh God. That's even worse, Annie replied, rolling her eyes. It's okay. They know you're mine, Cooper assured her with a grin as he opened the passenger door of the Jeep. Excuse me? She asked, appalled at being labeled. Feeling sick has robbed you of your sense of humor, Cooper told her, winking. She narrowed her eyes at him and sat back in the seat. With her eyes closed, she said, Can you please take me to camp, you goofball? Cooper snickered. At your service, my lady. Annie rolled her eyes under her closed lids. The man was both wonderful and insufferable. She liked him a lot, but she knew she was leaving in just 2 weeks and he was staying down here for a minimum of 2 months, possible 6. And while she was a student in New York, he had a position at the University of Texas in the archeological department. She didn't believe in long-distance relationships, so after the 2 weeks was up, she'd probably never see him again. She refused to get too attached to him. Logically, it made no sense. But her heart whispered to her sometimes when she looked at him. Which scared her to death. The nausea returned with a vengeance when Cooper hit a particularly deep pothole on the dirt road. She grabbed his shoulder. Pull over. Now. He looked at her, saw her face, and jerked to the side of the road and slammed on the brakes simultaneously. She had barely alighted from the Jeep when the entire contents of the water bottle she'd finished spewed out of her mouth. She heaved until every bit of it was out of her stomach. When Cooper had rounded the corner of the Jeep, she'd waved him away, embarrassed to throw up in front of him. Now that she was finished, she plopped back into the passenger seat, her legs dangling, and she waited for the next round. It didn't come. I really think you need to go into Rio tomorrow, Cooper said again. Annie nodded, although she felt so much better now that she'd thrown up. I think you might be right. I could use a Starbucks. He shook his head. Spewed like a geyser and wants a coffee. You amaze me. Thanks, I guess, she said. She straightened and looked around. I feel much better now that I've spewed like a geyser, she mimicked. Well, that's something, Cooper commented. He pulled a handkerchief out of his back pocket and wiped her brow with it. He poured some water on it from his bottle and wiped her brow again. That feels amazing, Annie said. She held her hand out for it and wiped along the back of her neck. She looked up at him. Thanks, Cooper. You're welcome, sweetheart, Cooper replied. And I'm sorry. Nothing to apologize for. It happens when you're in a new environment, Cooper said with a shrug. I picked up something when I first got here too. Couldn't shake it for about 2 weeks. I was as weak as a baby. Annie stared at him, bewilderment on her face. Mentally, she counted back to her last period and frowned, lost in thought. She didn't really pay attention to that because she'd never had to. She had no idea when she'd finished her last period nor when the next one would start. Her body warned her the day before with cramps, and she planned accordingly. The damn thing had never been regular. But she remembered when Leah had gotten pregnant. She'd been sick as a dog for about a week, maybe 2, and that's how she'd figured out she was pregnant. Certainly not, Annie thought, appalled by the thought. There's no way I'm pregnant. No way. She gnashed her teeth and growled a little. Cooper interrupted her thoughts. You've made about 8 completely different facial expressions in the last 10 seconds. What's going on? Annie stared at him. She couldn't say anything until she knew for sure. I was just thinking about going into Rio tomorrow. It might be fun, as long as I'm feeling okay. Cooper nodded, although she could tell he didn't believe her little diversion. I can take you. Yeah, that would be great, Cooper. Thanks, Annie said. She climbed back into the Jeep and buckled her seatbelt. Let's get going. I want to lie down for a while. Cooper leaned in and kissed her forehead, a sweet gesture she wasn't prepared for. Don't worry, sweetheart. Annie offered him a small smile and looked away. She remained silent, lost in her thoughts for the rest of the ride to the campsite. Chapter 5. Cooper and Annie left early the next morning. After Annie's hospital visit, she'd asked if they could do a little sightseeing since she wouldn't get to spend much time in the city. During the drive, they planned their day. Cooper, who had spent a few days in Rio when he needed internet access to communicate with the Grant people or his bosses at the university. Where did you have internet access? Annie asked, hoping to get away from him for a few minutes in order to email Leah about her condition, should she find out she were pregnant. Well, I stayed at one of the hotels, which had Wi-Fi, but it was incredibly sketchy. So I spent a good deal of my time at the Starbucks I mentioned yesterday. I was so hyped on caffeine I don't think I slept the whole time. Annie laughed. I'm the same. If I'm using their Wi-Fi, I feel like it's required to buy something. The barista was quite charming, Cooper told her with a suggestive wink. Annie looked at him balefully. Oh, really? He nodded. You are such a slut, she said, amused. Slut? Me? He touched his chest in mock offense. How dare you? Whatever. Annie shook her head, a small laugh escaping her. There's an awesome restaurant we have to eat at for lunch. I don't think there's a better restaurant in all of Rio, Cooper told her. Oh, really? What kind of food? Annie's stomach had actually been quite settled this morning. She hadn't felt the slightest bit nauseous, even when she'd eaten some fruit cocktail in a can. Traditional Brazilian cuisine. And not like that stuff you get in those so-called Brazilian restaurants at home. This food is the real deal. I'm excited to go. I'm not excited about the doctor, Annie said. Never fun, but sometimes necessary. We need to make sure it's just a virus and not something more serious. Annie frowned. She had watched him while he was speaking, wondering if he was thinking the same thing she was. She tilted her head in thought. No way, she thought with a smirk. If he was thinking the same thing I am, he'd be freaking out, not all calm and collected. She relaxed back into her seat, enjoying the lack of nausea as well as the company. He really is charming, and not in a smarmy way, she mused, watching him again as they rode in companionable silence. Annie had wanted to have sex with him almost from the moment she'd met him, once she had gotten over the fact that he'd been late to pick her up. And in her mind, she had thought she'd sleep with him once and be done, the itch was scratched and the need vanquished. However, she'd continued to sleep with him over the next week, several times, a couple days more than once. The itch, she'd thought she'd scratched, had returned with a vengeance. The need, which she had thought would dissipate after she'd tasted him, had only increased in intensity each time they slept together. "Wow, he's like meth," she mused, giggling quietly to herself at her own joke. "What's so funny?" Cooper asked, breaking the silence. "Oh, nothing." Annie refused to speak her thoughts out loud. The man may be charming, but his ego needed no boosting from her. "Yeah, okay," Cooper smirked at her. "We should be there in about 30. "That didn't seem very long," Annie commented, looking at the window for anything familiar. "Well, the first time you made this trip you were angry and we didn't talk until about halfway through the drive. That does make it longer." "Huh. I guess you're right." Her fast capitulation gave him the indication that she preferred the silence they'd shared. He lapsed into silence as well and let her enjoy the scenery. 10 minutes later, he pointed to their left. They were still miles from the city, but Annie could see the famous statue, Christ the Redeemer, perched on top of its hill, watching over the city. It had been dark when she'd driven through the city last time, and she hadn't been in the mood to look around. Now she was grateful to see the city for the first time in the daylight. Awed by the statue's overwhelming height. At nearly 100 feet, the statue guarded over the city like its subject watched over the world. Annie had never been a religious person, but the statue created a feeling of comfort and reverence inside her heart. Regardless of the outcome of the doctor's visit, Annie suddenly felt like everything would be just fine. She'd make it so. "I'm going to drop you off, if that's okay. I'll make the run for supplies while you're doing that and meet you at the Starbucks right over there." Cooper pointed a block down. On the corner was the familiar green sign with the siren. "I know you said you wanted to email your sister." Annie smiled. "Leah's not my sister, but she may as well be." "That sounds good. Hopefully this will be a quick in and out and I can enjoy a cup of real coffee with sugar and maybe whipped cream." Annie licked her lips in anticipation. Cooper shook his head and laughed. "Have fun." "You too," she said. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. He captured her cheek in his palm and held her for a longer kiss on the lips. When she pulled back, she smiled and patted his cheek affectionately. "See you in a bit, handsome." "Be careful, sweetheart," Cooper replied. He watched her walk into the hospital, marveling at her. She was so beautiful. He had watched as 3 men, 2 sitting outside on break and 1 exiting, had turned to watch her as she walked in. And she was blissfully unaware of the attention. Amazing, he thought with a smile as he put the Jeep in drive and headed to the market. Inside, Annie approached a reception desk and asked if there was a gynecologist on staff. She was directed to the appropriate floor and the location of the elevator. She meandered over and pushed the up button and waited, her nerves creating an uncomfortable tension in her shoulders. She stepped off the elevator and turned left, as instructed in broken English by the receptionist downstairs. The only door that looked like it led into an office had a bunch of Portuguese on it, and Annie cursed the fact that she hadn't learned the language, or at least Spanish, which was similar. She stepped into the office and looked around. 2 women, hugely pregnant, looked up from their magazines and smiled at her. Another cradled a newborn and did not bother to look away from her infant. The receptionist called out to her, so she walked over to the desk. "Hello. Do you speak English?" Annie asked, an apologetic look on her face. "Yes. Can I help you?" The woman's accent was so heavy Annie struggled to understand her. She smiled. Yes. I think I'm pregnant. And you're a shifter, no? The woman asked, reaching for a clipboard. Annie's brow furrowed and her eyes narrowed. How did you know that? The receptionist smiled at her, a kind smile with no hint of prejudice. I am a shifter. I can smell you. She handed her the clipboard with several papers. You know, you're the third shifter who has said that to me, but I can't do that, Annie told her as she took the clipboard with paperwork attached. Please fill these out. Have you taken a pregnancy test? No. I'm on an archeological dig in the middle of the jungle. I had to drive in, Annie told her. Interesting. Hold on. The woman held up a finger and pushed her wheelchair backwards. She dug through a drawer and pulled out a test. She wheeled herself back to Annie and handed it to her. Before you fill out the paperwork, let's make sure you're pregnant. She pointed to a door to her left. There's the bathroom. Pee on it, wait for the signal, throw it away, and come out and tell me. How long do I wait? Less than a minute. Annie nodded and walked into the bathroom. Awkwardly, she held the stick under her stream of urine, put the cap on the stick, and cleaned up. She washed her hands and glanced down at the stick. 2 lines. She was pregnant. Annie's shoulders sagged. What am I going to do now? 10 minutes later she was speaking with the doctor, who she had discovered was also a shifter and specialized in shifter pregnancies. She explained that she was out at the dig site and asked if she was safe there. I would think so, as long as you have the proper nutrition. I'll give you some supplements and prenatal vitamins, he told her. Now, you know that shifter pregnancies are very short. You're a week pregnant at this point, which means you're due in 6. You'll be showing by the end of next week, and you'll look like you're ready to pop in 3. When you're 6 weeks pregnant, you'll need to come to Rio and stay until after the baby is born. I have a plane ticket to return to the US in 2 weeks. Can I just fly home? Shifter pregnancies can be unpredictable. I wouldn't recommend flying back so late. If you can get a ticket for earlier, maybe. Your baby could come as early as 6 weeks and as late as 10. Annie rolled her eyes. Oh, good Lord. The doctor chuckled. Yes, it's a fun time. So can I shift while pregnant? The doctor tossed his head about as he thought. You're a week along, so maybe for 1 more week. After that, it will be incredibly uncomfortable for you and could harm your baby. Annie nodded, then froze. Holy shit. While sitting here, she'd made the decision to keep her child. The options had run through her head the night before when she was trying to fall asleep, and she had actively considered the quickest way to end a pregnancy. She honestly hated the idea, but she had considered it. When did I change my mind? She wondered. At the Starbucks, Annie signed onto their Wi-Fi after ordering a grande white mocha with extra whipped cream. Eating for 2, she rationalized with a smirk. Surprisingly, she was rather calm about the situation she found herself in. She was going to have a baby. She had to tell Cooper. But first, she had to contact Leah. Quickly, she placed a phone call on her cell to tell Leah to get on her email so they could chat back and forth. International calls were too expensive for the conversation Annie needed to have with her. Annie, Leah, I'm pregnant. Sorry to be so blunt, but I need advice and you're the only person who can help me. I've been to see the doctor here in Rio de Janeiro to confirm the pregnancy. And don't start lecturing. You did the same thing, haha. Leah, oh my God. You're pregnant. And stuck in South America. That's just fantastic. Okay, You've been to the doctor. When are you due? Can you get back to the US before then? And most importantly, have you told Cooper? Annie, I'm due in 6 weeks, according to the doctor. He said if I couldn't get a ticket back to the US next week that I just needed to stay here. I checked with the airline before emailing you. Everything is full. Anyway, having the child here will give him dual citizenship. Very useful. And the hospital I visited is no different from a US hospital. How do you know it's Cooper's? Maybe I fell for a Brazilian hunk. Leah, you're going to stay there? Are you sure? Are you going to stay in Rio or go back to the dig? And shut up. I know it's Cooper. I saw his picture. He's a hottie. You'd never be able to resist him, haha. Annie, I could have resisted him if I had tried. I just chose not to try, haha. I'm going back to the dig for another week, maybe 2. Then I'll come here and stay in a hotel for the rest of the pregnancy. Leah, I think you should stay in Rio for the entire pregnancy, just to be safe. Shifter pregnancies go so quickly. Complications could arise and you'd never be able to make it to the doctor. Annie, the doctor said I should be okay for 2 weeks. I have just a few more things to work on out there. If I get done earlier than planned, then I'll come back to town. Leah, all right, but be extra cautious. As soon as you get back to Rio, I want you to contact me. In the meantime, rather than staying in a hotel for so long, I'll do some research and find an apartment or something to rent for you. Annie, you don't have to do that, but I have to admit, I'd much rather stay somewhere other than a hotel. Leah, do you want me to come down there? Annie, no. You have Chloe to take care of. I'm a grown woman and got myself into this mess. I'll handle it. As soon as the baby is born and he can fly, we'll head back to the US. Leah, so have you told Cooper? Annie, not yet. I will this evening or tomorrow. He's walking into the Starbucks, so I have to go. Give Chloe a big kiss from me and say hello to Mark. I'll contact you as soon as I get back to Rio. I love you. Leah, love you too. Good luck with Cooper. Cooper swooped over and kissed her on the lips, hugging her tight before releasing her. He pointed at her cup and asked, "You need anything?" Annie shook her head. No thanks, I'm still working on this one. Give me a minute to order, he called as he walked up to the barista and ordered, flirting outrageously with her. Annie rolled her eyes when she saw him pointing at her while speaking to the woman. When he returned to their table, she asked, "What did you say to the barista?" Oh, just that I was with you so I couldn't go home with her after her shift, Cooper claimed as he added sugar to his coffee. Annie's eyes narrowed. You're lying. Cooper's eyes widened in a picture of angelic innocence. Annie, my sweet, I would never lie. That woman wanted a taste and I told her that was out of the question. Annie laughed loudly, holding her sides. A taste? You are the most arrogant man I've ever known. You went to college, so I know that's not true, he replied, pointing at her. He stirred his coffee and hummed a little tune before continuing. So, what did the doctor say? Annie looked away, using the task of wrapping her laptop power cord as an excuse not to look at him. She decided on a story to tell him for now. She'd tell him the truth in the next day or two. She was afraid he would try to leave her here in Rio if he knew she was pregnant, and she didn't want that. I have some kind of virus, just like you predicted, she lied, staring hard at the cord as she wound it around itself. Cooper gestured to the paper bag next to her laptop bag. Did he give you medicine? Yeah. Some kind of antibiotics and some anti-nausea stuff. Finished with her cord, she focused on shutting down the laptop and putting it in her bag. Did he say how long you would feel bad? No, she replied and changed the subject. So, is it time for lunch yet? I'm starved. Chapter 6. Wake up, gorgeous. Annie stretched her arms above her head and lolled her head to the right, her eyes still closed. When she finally opened them, Cooper was standing over her, smiling down at her with the sun behind his head. Positively angelic, she mused, giggling. What's so funny, giggly girl? Cooper asked, running a finger down the side of her face. Good morning, Cooper, she murmured, sleep in her voice. Maybe I was having a dirty dream and you ruined it. Oh, really? I like that. He handed her a bottle of water, a devilish grin on his face. Drink up, get up, and wash up. We're going for an excursion today. Annie lifted an eyebrow, a question in her eyes. An excursion? Don't we have work to do? We just found several new drawings. We do and we did, but we are stalled at the moment. The fellas have to stabilize the cave to prevent cave-ins. Safety first. We've seen everything we're going to see until tomorrow morning. So, we get 2 days off, Cooper said with a smile. He flopped down on the bed she'd vacated, watching her perfect body move gracefully as she dressed and washed her face. So what's the excursion? I'm going to show you a place that looks as much like heaven as we can find here on Earth, Cooper bragged dramatically. I'll wager a year's earnings you've never seen anything so beautiful in your life. Oh, really? Oh, yes, he said. A year's salary? Okay, I'll bet you $20. Annie put her hand out and he looked at it. Shake on it. Cooper laughed. All right then. He gestured to a basket near the door. I've made us a picnic. We'll pack a blanket and have a fantastic time. Do you have a swimsuit here? Yes, but I'm not sure where it is, Annie mumbled around her toothbrush. Let me finish this and I'll dig for it. No rush, baby. We've got plenty of time, Cooper assured her. Find your swimsuit and a towel, stuff them in a bag, and meet me at the Jeep. I don't need anything else? Nope. Just that, unless you'd like to swim nude. That would be okay with me, he told her. He winked, leaned in for a quick kiss, and walked out the door. Annie frowned after him. They'd spent the entire day together yesterday, eating lunch and exploring Rio. He'd shown her some of the more lovely sections of Rio, as well as some of the not-so-beautiful. Annie admitted she was falling in love with Brazil and wished she didn't have to leave. After grabbing a quick bite for dinner, they made it back to the camp just after dark. So many times she'd had the opportunity to tell Cooper that she was pregnant, but she'd excused herself from actually saying anything each time. They had made love in the camper, and she'd lain awake after, going over in her mind how she would tell him the next day. And now he'd presented her with a fantastic opportunity. Again, they'd be alone the entire day. She vowed that he would know about the pregnancy before they returned to the camp. She grabbed her bikini, which she'd found rolled up and stuffed in a pocket in her bag. She tossed it and a towel in the bag he'd left for her and scurried out the door to meet Cooper by the Jeep. How's the nausea today? Cooper asked. Annie realized she hadn't felt the least bit sick this morning. The medicine must be working. I feel great. Want to try and eat something? She debated long enough to hear her stomach growl. Yeah, I better eat something. She grabbed some fruit from the kitchen area and joined him at the Jeep once more. Okay, I'm ready for an adventure, sir. You're going to get one, I assure you, Cooper said with a grin. Climb in, hot stuff. You're going to love this. Where are we going? Annie asked, her smile growing with his excitement. It's a surprise, silly woman. Now sit back and relax. This time tomorrow we'll be knee-deep in work, so just enjoy. Annie offered him a mock salute. Yes, sir. Always the smart ass. Why do I even try? Because boredom isn't your thing, Annie reminded him. Cooper nodded sagely. Ah, yes. You know me well. Annie smiled. She did know him well, and they'd only known each other a week. Odd, she thought. She felt as if she'd known him for years, not days. What did that mean? Nothing, she told herself. It just means he and I have a lot in common, that's all. She changed her line of thinking. Now was not the time to be contemplating what this meant or that meant. So give me a hint, Annie said as they bounced along a trail that might have once been a road but was now nothing more than two ruts leading in the same direction through the jungle. She kept her eyes peeled for any signs of wildlife. She was really hoping to see more monkeys. Well, you remember the little creek? When she nodded assent, he continued. If you follow that creek about 5 miles in one direction, you'll find something beautiful. I followed it one afternoon in my lion form and ended up spending the night in the jungle because I'd gone so far and was exhausted. When I woke up, there it was. He lifted his hand in an arch as if showing her something grand. How dramatic you are, Annie laughed. You better deliver. You've got $20 writing on it. Oh, I'll deliver. You just better not lie. I won't lie. How dare you, she screeched. It better be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Cooper took her hand and kissed her palm. I have never seen anything more beautiful. He shrugged and added, well, until I saw you the first time. Annie laughed. Oh my God, you're such a charmer. Cooper tilted his head to look at her as if confused by her reaction. He returned his eyes to the road in front of them. I'm not being charming, Annie. I really do think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Annie stared at him, shocked. She had no words. But he didn't seem to need any from her. He kissed her hand again and winked at her, a knowing smile on his face. An hour later, he said, get ready. It's just around this bend. He parked the Jeep under a tree and turned it off. Annie tilted her head, an unfamiliar roar could be heard just behind the trees. She frowned, contemplating the noise, pondering the possibilities. Then her eyes widened when she realized what was making the noise. A waterfall, she gushed. She jumped out of the Jeep and ran around the copse of trees, leaving Cooper behind to get their picnic, laughing at her haste to see the magnificence the trees held. He rushed after her, only catching up to her when she had stopped and stared in awe. The waterfall appeared to rush straight out of a rock formation nearly 30 feet wide. Only 10 or 15 feet in height, the undertow wasn't strong enough to pull a person under. The water didn't rush too quickly over the rocks, which would allow one to sit and let the water flow over her. Surrounded by lush greenery, the water was the perfect contrast, a soft azure. An outcropping made of rock slipped out over the water, hovering above the water, almost begging for someone to have a picnic on it or use it as a makeshift diving board. Annie imagined heaven looked a lot like this. Her eyes refused to look around. One of her bucket list items had been crossed off. She'd found a sight that literally took her breath away. She reached out her hand and waited for Cooper to take it. When he did, he stepped to her, and despite the heat, he put his body against hers and an arm around her waist. "Cooper, thank you," Annie whispered almost reverently. Speaking in a normal tone of voice seemed inappropriate in this place. "You're welcome, Annie," he whispered back. "Truly dazzling," she murmured, staring, mesmerized by the magnificence. Cooper was watching Annie, his eyes on her face. His heart, which he'd commanded to behave, thumped at the sight of her, mesmerized by something he'd shown her. "I think I'm in love with her," he thought. "And it doesn't even scare me. Damn." Her eyes were watery with unshed tears, and he was amazed. He had fallen in love with the beauty of this place, but for her, it was so lovely it made her cry. He was proud to have given someone a moment such as this, and even more proud that he'd given it to Annie. "I'll give you $20 when we get back to camp." Annie's smile had not left her face. "Can we swim in it?" "Of course. And if you'll go naked, we can forget that $20, Cooper suggested with an eyebrow wiggle. Annie looked at him, a mischievous smile on her face. "Last one in has to get out first and set up lunch." She was stripping before she'd finished her sentence. Cooper slowly undressed, more intent on watching her lithe form as she, rather ungracefully, stripped. And still he found her sexy as she kicked her shoes off with her pants around her ankles. He'd only unbuttoned his pants, and she was completely nude before him. She pointed at him, laughed as if she'd never had a better time in her life, and jumped off the rock outcropping, disappearing in a plume of water. After jumping into the water, Annie waited for Cooper to join her, and her thoughts returned to the little being in her belly. She put her hand on her stomach and jolted. She had a small bulge, just big enough to feel. She doubted it was noticeable if one only looked at her. She smiled. She was becoming accustomed to the idea of a baby in her life. But then she frowned. She had to tell Cooper. Guilt was beginning to set it. Lost in thoughts, Cooper Jungles screamed as he flew off the rock outcropping and cannonballed into the water, dousing her completely. A lengthy splash fight later, they swam together to the waterfall. The rush was just a little too much to stand under, so they climbed up and sat on the rock formation, allowing the water to slosh over their legs. Their legs were entwined, and Cooper was running his hand up and down her thigh. Heat began to build with only that much encouragement. Cooper shifted so they were side by side. He leaned over and took her mouth with his, cupping the back of her head gently. "Just amazed that I'm laying here in the open, completely naked for all the world to see. What if someone else knows about this place? Then we'll get caught, I guess. We won't get arrested, at least." Just gawked at by the natives, Cooper laughed. "Well, that's comforting." Annie sat up and batted his chest playfully with her hand. "Come on. Let's get the food out. I'm starved." Cooper leaned over and grabbed the basket. They began unloading the food, and Annie laughed. "You packed enough for an army." "Well, I knew we'd work up an appetite. Swimming, fucking, maybe fucking again when we're done eating," Cooper said, dodging her swatting hand. "Don't be crass," Annie said without heat. He winked at her and asked, "Would you like me to feed you grapes, my dainty goddess?" Annie giggled quietly and laid back with her arms behind her head. "Yes, slave. And when I'm full, I want you to drive me wild with passion once again." She opened her mouth for a grape, and he delicately placed one on her tongue. "With your mouth, if you don't mind." "Not at all, my queen," Cooper said with a grin as he popped a grape into his own mouth. "When do we have to go back?" Annie asked, looking up into the sky. The sun was still high, but she had no idea what time it was. "Whenever we want. Before dark is all I care about," Cooper said through a mouthful of food. These grapes are amazing, Annie said, glancing at them. They're locally grown, Cooper said. I bought wine from the same vineyard but left it at camp. We'll just have to drink it another time. Annie silently said thanks to the gods for the fact that the wine was still in camp. Their day had been so wonderful, she wasn't ready to ruin it with her little, or rather, big surprise. She smiled at him and patted his cheek. I think I'm going to get dressed before my boobs get sunburned, Annie said, rising to find her clothes, which were scattered from the tree line to the rock outcropping. As she walked, she gathered his clothes as well. She deposited them beside him and pulled her underwear on just as an earth-shattering scream ripped through the jungle. Annie froze, her underwear near her knees. She jerked them up as Cooper rose, still completely nude, to stand in front of her as a group of natives surrounded the rock outcropping, cutting off every exit except into the water. Annie looked behind them. There were natives on the beach across from them as well. There really was nowhere to go. Chapter 7. Annie clutched Cooper's arm, shielding her nudity from the natives as best as she could. She watched warily as the group of mostly men moved a little closer. The women who were with them wore only brown loincloths, like the men, their breasts bare and sagging. All of them wore some kind of red face paint, and all of them had similar hair, short, shaggy, and dark. Several of them held spears or other types of weapons. The one who seemed to be the leader carried a machete. Annie had done her research about the types of people who lived in the jungle. Most of them were harmless as long as you stayed out of their villages or within a certain distance. But this group seemed barbaric and fully prepared to kill them should the need arise. When she told people she planned to travel and stay in the jungles of Brazil so she could complete her thesis, so many had spoken of cannibalistic tribes. Nothing she'd found gave any indication of truth in their statements. However, looking around at the dozens of natives surrounding them, armed and glaring as if she and Cooper had trespassed on sacred land, those words haunted her. "What do we do?" Annie asked, a tremor in her voice she couldn't control. "I know the language of this group." "Somewhat," Cooper said. "Somewhat? What if you say the wrong thing because you don't know the difference?" Annie asked. "Just stay behind me." Cooper raised his voice and spoke words that sounded like garbled Spanish to her. The natives had quieted and were listening to him, which surprised her. They waited patiently for him to finish his sentences. The machete-wielding leader replied to him, and Annie thought his voice sounded calm, almost friendly, so her shoulders relaxed a little. But under her hands, she felt Cooper stiffen and heard him suck in a breath. She opened her mouth to question him, but he spoke again before she could. After several more exchanges of words, Cooper turned to face her and spoke quietly to her. "They don't speak English, so we can speak freely." Cooper was speaking to her, but he was looking past her and appeared to be counting how many were on the beach behind them. Annie glanced back as well, frowning. "So what's going on?" "He doesn't sound mad or anything," Annie commented quietly. "His tone is deceptive. He wants us to return to their village with them," Cooper told her, his eyes still focused behind her, calculating. "Is that not a good idea?" Annie asked, confused. "People who go to villages in this jungle don't always return from those villages," Cooper informed her. His count finished, he looked into her eyes. "We're probably going to have to shift in order to get out of this." Annie's thoughts immediately went to her baby, but the doctor had assured her she could still shift for another week or so just yesterday. She nodded at Cooper. "All right. If I give you the signal, shift and fly up into the trees." "Where will you go?" Annie asked, her frown indicating her worry. He smiled reassuringly at her. "Don't worry, babe. When I shift, they'll be so surprised I'll be able to zip past them before they realize it. Most of these natives have never seen a shifter. They don't get out of the jungle. You just make sure you fly high enough so they can't hit you with anything, but low enough that you can see me and fly in the right direction. What about the jeep? Cooper shook his head, smiling at her. What a thing to think of. He ran a hand over her face, and she returned his smile with one of her own. You ready? What's the signal? I'll yell shift. Pretty simple. Cooper winked at her and returned his attention to the leader of the natives. He spoke more forcefully, obviously refusing to return to the village. Several of the men in the group began hollering, and one of the women stepped forward. She looked different than the others. She carried no weapon, she held what looked like a scepter made of a thigh bone from some large creature. Her hair hung to the middle of her back rather than in the short, choppy cuts of her peers, and her clothes covered her breasts and were ornamented with bones of all sizes. Annie wondered briefly if they were animal or human. Her research would be doubled when she got home. The woman lifted a hand, and the jungle filled with silence. She spoke softly to Cooper in what Annie thought was a reassuring tone. As she spoke, trying to capture the attention of her captives, Annie glanced behind them. The natives on the beach had entered the water and were moving closer to the rock outcropping, closing off their escape should they try to run in that direction. She returned her attention to the natives in front of them. They too had begun inching closer. Her grip on Cooper's arm tightened. He felt it and murmured, "This is their medicine woman. She claims she only wants a clipping of our hair and a few drops of blood, then we'll be released." A few drops of our blood? For what? Doesn't matter. They aren't getting it, Cooper told her. The woman had watched closely while Cooper and Annie spoke but didn't interrupt. The vague feeling that the woman understood at least a portion of their conversation sank into Annie's mind, and she wondered if the woman knew their plan to shift should things get any hairier. When Cooper's eyes met the woman's again, she raised her eyebrows in question but didn't speak to him. Cooper tried to reason with the woman once more, hoping she would allow them to go free. The man Annie had assumed was the leader because of his choice of weapon had deferred to this woman when she'd stepped up. The choice to let them go or try to capture them was hers. Annie looked behind them. The natives were closer. The woman's decision had been made before she began speaking to Cooper. She planned to take them to her village for whatever nefarious purpose she had in mind. Cooper realized this too. The natives in front of them and on both sides were closing in. He reached up and touched Annie's hand, squeezing it to calm her as well as warn her. She squeezed his shoulder in response, prepared for his signal to shift and fly up and away from the scene. Her stomach jittered uncomfortably. What if Cooper couldn't get away once he'd shifted? What if they caught him and stabbed him while she was safe in the trees? There would be nothing she could do. Her terror reached a pitch that affected her entire body, which had begun to shake. But she had another life to think of, her babies. Suddenly, her child's safety superseded Cooper's, which made her feel a little guilty. She had to protect her child by any means, even if it meant leaving Cooper behind. Tears filled her eyes, and she blinked furiously to rid her eyes of them. She had to be prepared. She put her emotions aside, squared her shoulders, and waited for Cooper. Cooper spoke again to the woman, whose fiery eyes spoke of a rage Annie could not understand. She yelled at Cooper, and her minions yelled with her, a cacophony of racket that frightened Annie's soul. "Shift and fly away. Now," Cooper said. Annie obeyed immediately, shifted, spread her wings, and flew to a tree high above them so she could watch. The woman screeched in fury at the loss of her prey, but the people with her fell back in fear, their eyes huge as they watched what used to be a woman and now was an owl fly up into a nearby tree and light on a branch high above the ground. Cooper gauged their reactions to Annie's shifting, surmising that only the medicine woman knew of the existence of shifters. He looked at her and grinned. She rushed towards him, hefting her scepter above her head, aimed at his heart. Annie's owl hooted and flapped her wings in warning, but Cooper had the situation handled. Just as the woman reached him, he shifted, throwing his paws into the air and letting them land on the woman's shoulders, expertly knocking the dangerous scepter out of her hand. She fell beneath his weight, and he landed gingerly on top of her, roaring in her face. The woman cringed, her arms crossed over her face in a defensive gesture. Cooper looked down at her briefly, then back up at her minions. They stared, aghast, as Cooper walked over the woman's body towards them. Several dropped to the ground in reverence, others dropped their weapons and hurried away, not looking back. Cooper roared again, watching the natives cringe away from him. The woman, meanwhile, had regained her feet and was screaming at the men. Annie had no idea what she was saying, but her gestures indicated she wanted the men to rise and capture Cooper. But fear held them in its grip and wouldn't let them go. They remained on the ground as Cooper sauntered through them, sometimes growling menacingly at them when one dared to lift his head to look at him. When he reached the last of them, he shifted again into his human form and called back to the woman. She screamed in frustration, grabbed the closest spear, and threw it the distance between them easily. Cooper, much to Annie's surprise, sidestepped the weapon and caught it neatly in his left hand. He looked at the woman, one brow raised in arrogance. He snapped the spear over his knee, shifted, and disappeared into the jungle. Annie lifted off her perch in the tree and flew after him, flying just low enough to see his massive body galloping between the trees quickly, putting as much distance between himself and the natives as possible. For a moment, as she flew, she could hear the squawking of the woman, her anger-filled words causing a tremor to run through Annie's wings. She dipped a little in her flight, and by the time she'd corrected her trajectory, the woman could no longer be heard. About a mile away, Cooper shifted into his human form, mourning the loss of his clothes. The trek back to the camper was a long haul from here. He looked up into the sky and called out to Annie. She landed gracefully next to him and shifted as well. "Oh my God," Annie said as soon as she was human again. She put her hand on her chest and walked toward him. "That was the scariest, most intense experience of my life." "Scared the shit out of me," Cooper agreed. "What did you say to her when you turned around?" "I told her she needed to teach her people about shifters or this would always happen," Cooper said with shrug. Annie laughed. "You were amazing. I hate to inflate your ego, but the way you caught that spear. Wow. All in a day's work, pretty lady," Cooper said with a wink. He looked around and up at the sky to judge direction. "Well, camp is that direction." He pointed. "And probably a 3 or 4 hour walk in human form. 2 hours for me as a lion. Less for me as an owl," Annie bragged. "But I'll fly slow and keep up with you." "You're so kind," Cooper replied blandly. Annie lowered her body into a curtsy and shifted almost simultaneously. She remained on the ground, looking up at him with her huge eyes batting patiently. He stared down at her, chuckled and rolled his eyes before shifting. She lifted up and perched on his back, careful to keep her talons on the mane rather than the fur so she didn't hurt him. She rode on his back for a time, making hoots and coos to entertain him. While riding, she decided that as soon as they got back to the camp, she would tell him about their baby. A flutter of both excitement and fear washed through her owl tummy. After resting, bathing, and dressing in fresh clothes, Annie asked Cooper if she could speak with him privately. They had been regaling the group with the tales of their adventure, each of them telling different parts or adding to the others. All agreed they were lucky to have gotten out alive, a human would not have been so lucky. And honestly, Annie had never been more grateful to be a shifter in her life. She took Cooper's hand and pulled him into the camper. Before she spoke, she hugged him tightly and kissed him gently. He smiled at her, baffled by her behavior. "What's going on?" he asked, bemused. "Why don't we sit down?" She led him to the bed, which was the most comfortable area in the camper. She held his hand, took a deep breath, and said, "I have something I need to tell you." "Okay," he said, drawing the word out in confusion. "Are you all right?" "I'm okay, just a little nervous." She took another deep breath and looked at him. "Okay, so remember when I was sick earlier this week? Well, I lied to you about what the doctor told me." "You lied? What's wrong with you? Do you have something worse than a stomach bug?" "I'm pregnant." She watched his face, which had been drawn in concern, sag into shock. "Pregnant? How is that possible? Aren't you on the pill or anything?" "I'm not. I didn't even think about it, or about using a condom." "I doubt you even have one out here," Annie said with a short laugh. He shook his head but did not share her laugh. She waved a hand in the air dismissively. "Anyway, next Monday I'm going back to Rio de Janeiro to stay until the baby is born. It's such a short gestation period, there would be no reason for me to come back after the next doctor's visit. Mark and Leah are finding an apartment for me to stay in while I wait for the baby to get here." "Sounds like you've planned everything out," Cooper said quietly. "Well, it's kind of what you have to do." "Prepare and stuff," Annie murmured, his tone frightening to her. "Have you thought about the alternatives?" "Alternatives? What do you mean?" Cooper sighed. "Come on, Annie, you know exactly what I mean." "Do I have to say it? You want me to get an abortion?" Her voice had risen in both volume and pitch. Cooper lifted his hands defensively. "I just think it's something to discuss, Annie. A baby is a big responsibility. A life-changing event that I think we're too young to deal with right now." Annie stared at him, appalled. She hadn't expected anything from him, but she certainly hadn't expected him to suggest an abortion. She reined in her anger with a slow inhale and exhale. She looked at him impassively, emotionless. "Listen, Cooper. I should have started this conversation a different way. I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect you to come to Rio and stay. I don't even expect you to be a part of the baby's life if you don't want to be. I can handle it on my own." Cooper stared at her. The way she was looking at him, as if he were just some one-night stand who had knocked her up, hurt him more than he would admit. "I'm not saying that, Annie. If the child is mine, then I want to be a part of his life." Annie raised an eyebrow. "If? You know what I mean," Cooper sighed. "I'll take you to Rio next week. Will the apartment be ready by then?" Leah said she would do her best. "When I get there, I'll email her and find out. If it's not, I'll stay at a hotel until it is." The monotonous tone of her voice worried him. If her attitude and voice were any indication, Annie was finished with him. His heart thumped for attention. "Fix this," it yelled at his brain. But his brain was working in slow motion. He had to decide how involved in the life of the baby he wanted to be. All he could think about was his career. "That sounds good," he mumbled. "I'll take you on Monday." "Okay. Thanks," Annie replied. I'm going for a walk." "I need a little time on my own," Cooper said. "Yeah, sure. I understand." I don't really know what to say about all this yet," he told her, looking down on her from his standing position. Annie rolled her eyes in exasperation. You don't have to say anything right now, Cooper. Go for your walk. She looked away from him and waved her hand towards the door. He hesitated. Her voice sounded tearful. He debated for a moment longer, should he stay or go, and after a handful of seconds, he turned and walked out, closing the door to the camper softly behind him. Annie listened as his footsteps faded. A single tear slipped out of her eye. A decision flitted through her brain, and she rose to accomplish it. She wiped her face and took a quick swig of water to calm herself. She yanked her bag out from under the table and tossed her things in it as quickly as possible. The apartment would obviously not be ready today, so she would head for the hotel. Buddy had sent a couple of men to retrieve the Jeep, and she'd heard them rumble back into camp about an hour ago. She couldn't just take the Jeep, even though that's what she wanted to do, so she'd ask Buddy to take her. She didn't think he'd mind. She finished packing and glanced around, checking to make sure she'd left nothing behind. Her research on the drawings and dig site was incomplete, but with a new baby, Annie had serious doubts she'd finish her degree on time. Or at all. But that no longer mattered to her. What mattered to her was her child and his safety. With determination, she opened the camper door and walked out, looking in all directions for Cooper. When she saw no sign of him, she walked to Buddy's camper and knocked swiftly and loudly. A series of banging noises greeted her before the door slammed open and Buddy stared down at her, confusion in his sleep-filled eyes. "Annie? Is something wrong?" Buddy asked, his eyes clearing quickly as he realized it was her. She'd wiped her face, but her emotions were palpable. Yes actually. Can you please take me into Rio de Janeiro?" "What? Now?" he asked, shocked. "Why don't you ask Cooper to take you?" "I can't. Please, Buddy. I'll explain on the way." Annie smiled at him. "I'll even pay for a hotel room for you if you'd like. Think about it. A soft mattress, and you could have a decent breakfast in the morning." Buddy shook his head, a grin on his face. "Dang, girl. You sure know how to entice an old man into giving you your way." Annie smiled a little. "Sometimes. Let me put on some decent clothes." "Give me 5 to gather up some stuff to take," Buddy told her. Annie nodded and left him to it. She walked over to the Jeep and put her things in the back. She hoped Cooper would be gone long enough for her and Buddy to leave. She glanced at her watch, he'd only been gone 10 minutes. She assumed he'd be gone at least 30 to think things over. While she sat there waiting for Buddy, she grumbled under her breath, her anger growing again. What exactly does he need to think about? She thought. They were having a baby. That wasn't something to be thought about. Annie assumed, based on his reaction, that his version of being a part of the child's life was sending money and occasionally stopping in to see him. Annie frowned. She'd honestly rather he not be in the child's life if that was all he planned to offer, and she would inform him of that, should she actually see him again. "Hell, I'm probably doing him a favor, taking off like this," she mused. "I'm taking the decision out of his hands." Buddy stepped out of his camper and walked to the Jeep. He tossed an overnight bag in the back and climbed in, started the ignition, and they sped off towards Rio. Chapter 8. Annie wished Buddy a good night as they walked to their separate rooms at the hotel in Rio. As Buddy stepped off the elevator on his floor, he took her hands, squeezed them, and offered his assistance should she ever need it. She thanked him and let the elevator doors close. She didn't plan to be up before he left, so they'd said their goodbyes as well. Once she reached her room, she placed a call to Leah's cell phone. She answered, and Annie told her to get on her email so they could talk. Annie, so I told Cooper about the baby. I'm pretty sure he was in shock because he didn't really speak much for a minute or so. When he finally could speak, he asked why I wasn't getting an abortion. That a baby right now would ruin our careers, we aren't old enough to deal, etc. Leah, what? How could he suggest that? He's not as much like Mark as I thought he was. Where are you? Annie, I'm at a hotel in Rio. No way was I staying at that campsite after our little discussion. Leah, are you okay? Annie didn't answer right away. That question had so many answers, depending on what meaning she decided the question had. If Leah was asking if she was okay physically, the answer was yes. She felt really good, actually, although she was a little hungry and was contemplating room service at 10 o'clock at night. If Leah was asking if she okay with having a baby in a strange country by herself, the answer was maybe. Annie had been an independent soul her whole life, she could handle anything, even if she was a little scared. But if Leah was asking if she was okay with what happened between her and Cooper, the answer was no. She hated to admit it, even to herself, but Annie had fallen for the man who had fathered her child. His suggestion had been like a knife to her heart. Logically, she understood his reasoning, but her heart wouldn't allow her to do such a thing. Worst of all, Annie never would have thought Cooper would make such a suggestion, which made the fact that he had done it even worse. Her laptop pinged. Leah was asking for an answer. Leah, Annie? Are you there? Annie, I'm sorry. I was flipping through the room service menu. I'm starved. Leah, so are you okay? Annie, yeah, I'm okay. I'm just surprised that he would make that suggestion. He didn't seem like that kind of guy. Leah, I'm sorry. Annie, me too, but it is what it is. Leah, the apartment Mark and I found will be available Sunday evening, so you can move in Monday morning. That will save you a lot of annoyances over the next couple of weeks. And don't worry about rent. Mark and I have covered it for 3 months. Annie, Leah. I can pay my rent. And I only need it for 2 months, not 3. Leah, you won't want to rush back after the baby is born, so this way you'll have a little time to do as you wish. What are you going to do while you're there? Annie, work on my thesis. I got almost everything I needed at the dig. I'm going to make what I have work. And I have to go to the doctor tomorrow. Leah, I thought you didn't have to go back until next week. Annie proceeded to tell Leah about the adventure she and Cooper had shared while in the jungle. Leah was fascinated by the story and told her she should write it up as part of her thesis. Annie laughed but decided the current Brazilian natives' behavior has nothing to do with the ancient Brazilians, so she'd just leave that out. Before ending the conversation, Leah wrote to her that she and Chloe would be flying into Rio in 2 weeks to stay with her for the rest of her pregnancy. Annie had explained, once again, that she didn't have to do that, but Leah had insisted, so Annie had capitulated. After ending the email conversation, Annie called downstairs and asked if the kitchen was still serving. She'd chosen this hotel because it was upscale and so had more amenities. Although she'd have to pull money out of her trust fund, she had decided it was worth it. Luckily, the kitchen was open, so she ordered a burger and fries to be sent up in 30 minutes. She took a shower during that time, feeling cleaner than she'd felt since arriving in Brazil. While the water washed away the grime of several days at a campsite, Annie let her thoughts run. She was sad about Cooper, but she would just have to live with it. He had made his choice, and it wasn't one she could live with. Mentally, she said goodbye to him, hoping she'd never have to see him again. When Cooper had returned to camp nearly an hour after walking away, his decision had been made. He wanted to be a part of the baby's life, and he wanted to be a part of Annie's life, if she would have him. He hoped her emotionless reaction to his statement about the baby being a burden was a protective defense mechanism rather than her real feelings for him. Before that, he'd felt like they were heading in a direction that would end up in a relationship. He knew he loved her, but he still questioned her feelings for him. And now that he'd screwed up so badly with the news of a baby, he hoped she'd at least listen to him when he explained his first bad reaction, and that after thinking, he realized what he truly wanted. He wanted her, and their baby, and a life together. Nervous, he knocked on the door of the camper, which seemed ridiculous to him because it was, after all, his camper. But he wanted to give her space just like she'd given him. When there was no answer, he opened the door and looked in, but it was empty. He closed the door and looked around as if expecting her to walk up at any moment. After what happened with the natives, he knew she wouldn't travel far from camp alone, so that left only one place for her to go. With rapid steps, he walked over to Buddy's camper and knocked, again without an answer. He opened the door and called out, but there was no reply. He peered inside, empty. Frowning, he closed the door and looked around again. The Jeep was gone, he noticed, and the fact sunk into his mind like a sinking ship. She was gone. Buddy must have taken her into Rio, and he could do nothing until Buddy returned with the Jeep. He walked over to the kitchen area and plopped onto a seat, his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands. At this late hour, Cooper knew Buddy would wait until morning to return. Traveling in the dark was not safe. Damn, I really screwed up, Cooper thought as he walked to his camper, where he knew he wouldn't get any sleep. Cooper had managed to fall asleep but jerked awake when he heard the Jeep lumbering back into the camp. He realized it was nearly 10, shocked that he'd slept so late. He bounded out of the room and to Buddy, who had opened the door of his camper and was tossing his bag inside. When he heard Cooper's footsteps, he turned, frowning at him. Just getting up? Yes. Where did you take her? Cooper's voice was hard and antagonistic. Buddy's eyebrows shot up. Pardon me? I asked you where you took her. I need to talk to her, Cooper replied. Buddy shook his head, frowning again. You know where I took her. And for the record, I don't blame her one bit for going. Cooper's eyes flared. This is none of your damn business, Buddy. Cooper walked to the Jeep with the intention of climbing in. Where are the keys? In my pocket, and you can have them when you've calmed down. I won't have you gunning off to Rio to talk to that girl while you're so pissed. Why would you take her without waiting for me to come back? Why would you suggest killing your own child? Buddy ducked when Cooper took a swing at him. He grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the Jeep hard enough to knock the breath out of him. Cooper's eyes were wide with both anger and surprise. Buddy put his face close to Cooper's and said, Young man, you're angry at yourself, not me. Face what you've done, let it fill with the guilt, then go fix it. But don't throw it out at me or anybody else. Cooper's anger, which had been strong enough to kill, ebbed immediately. Buddy was right, and he knew it. His body sagged, and Buddy let him go. I'm sorry. I screwed up. Yes, you did. But while she was telling me the story, I could hear the forgiveness in her voice. I don't think she knows she forgives you, but she will. Go prove to her what she means to you. Cooper nodded. Thank you, Buddy, for taking care of her and me. We both needed it. Buddy fished the keys to the Jeep out of his pocket, grinning at Cooper. I knew you'd want to turn right around and head back to Rio, so I filled the Jeep up. She's not going anywhere, so take your time. Cooper nodded. I probably need the time to think. I have no idea what I'll say to her. It'll come when you see her, I'm sure. buddy told him the name of the hotel, patted his back, and told him to get going. Cooper jumped in the Jeep and sped off, his thoughts in a jumble as he hurried through the jungle. After a sumptuous breakfast in the hotel restaurant, Annie walked to the hospital. She'd chosen the hotel not only for its amenities but also because it was 2 blocks from her doctor. As she walked, she felt an uncomfortable sense of someone watching her. She glanced behind her, but no one was paying any special attention to her. While glancing behind her, she slammed into someone in front of her, nearly falling back. A pair of hands caught her arms. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry!" Annie exclaimed as she looked up. She instantly recognized the werewolf from the airport just the week before. She frowned and stepped back, shaking his hands off her arms. "Hello, Annie." Annie lifted an eyebrow and went on the offense. "How exactly do you know my name, sir?" "I have my sources, Annie," the man assured her with a creepy sneer. He looked her up and down, focusing longer on her stomach than anywhere else. "I understand you're expecting a baby." A chill ran down Annie's spine. "That is none of your damn business." "Excuse me." Annie attempted to go around him, but he sidestepped and prevented her. "Move, please." The man shook his head, his grizzled beard glistening in the sun. "No. I need to talk to you about this baby." He stepped even closer to her, forcing her back and closer to the wall. "You see, that baby is a danger to our way of life here in Brazil." "My baby isn't a danger to anything except destroying prejudices," Annie replied. She really had no idea what this man was talking about, but she focused on verbal exchanges so she could find an escape. She wasn't really in danger, they were on a crowded street. But she had no friends here and had no idea to whom she could turn if the man grew violent. The man chuckled menacingly. "Well, now, that's an ugly thing to say. Let me explain. Cross-species babies are dangerous, unpredictable creatures. We don't allow them here." "Don't allow them?" "That's ridiculous. You know, it's not too late to take care of this on your own." He shrugged meaningfully. "If you choose to continue this pregnancy, however, I can't predict what might happen to you and your child." Annie stared. Her fear was clear on her face, she knew it, but she could do nothing about it. He smiled at her, a frightful smile that showed the wolf within. He took her arm and tried to pull her down the street. "Come on. There is a clinic that specializes in these kinds of things just down the road. Let's handle this now." Annie tried to jerk her arm out of his grasp, but he tightened his hand to crushing. A bruise would surely bloom there later. "Let me go. I am not going anywhere with you." "Annie, Annie," he said, yanking her up against him so that their faces were inches apart. "This can be handled in a civilized manner. Or I can shift here and cut you open, killing both you and the brat. Do you want to die with it?" Annie opened her mouth to reply, but the werewolf was jerked away from her. He didn't release his grip at first, and she almost fell. A hand steadied her. She looked up into Cooper's eyes, eyes that were on fire. "Are you okay?" he asked. Behind him, the werewolf stood. Annie nodded her head and indicated the man behind him. Cooper wheeled around. His voice sounded like a growl. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "Hello, Dad," the man snarled. "I asked you a question," Cooper reiterated. "Your little birdie there and I were having a conversation. That baby in her belly needs to go, one way or another," the man said, the false cordiality back in his voice. "That is not a decision you get to make." "Walk away," Cooper threatened. The man shook his head. "I can't do that." The baby is dangerous. Either she handles it with a medical professional, or I'll handle it with my teeth. He snapped his mouth closed threateningly, looking at Annie and back to Cooper. Annie watched as Cooper's body began to shake. He was trying to control his temper and not shift in the middle of the street. The werewolf in his man form waited patiently for him to lose control. Annie stepped forward and took Cooper's hand in hers. "Cooper, let's go." "I have an appointment," Annie said. The werewolf grabbed Annie's arm. "You do have an appointment. At the abortion clinic." Cooper shifted the moment the man's skin made contact with Annie's. He leapt at the man, who shifted instantaneously into his werewolf form. Annie was pushed out of the way and landed on her knees, scraping both palms to keep from hitting her face on the ground. Screams erupted around them as humans deserted the streets to escape the rabid brawl taking place between the two magnificent creatures. Lion and wolf, fighting for the right to take the bird. The pair were up on hind legs, growling and snarling, scratching and attempting to bite. The werewolf went for Cooper's throat, but the large mane protected him from the sharp teeth. Cooper scored the werewolf's side, leaving long, deep gashes, while the wolf used its claws to dig through the mane and pierce the sensitive skin. Cooper managed to jerk away before the claws could dig in too deeply, but soon his mane was bloody. They separated briefly before attacking again, Cooper diving in with his feline agility and managing again to claw the werewolf's face. The werewolf screamed in pain and anger as more blood escaped his body. The claw marks down his face would leave scars even in his human form. In retaliation, he bit Cooper's ear and yanked, pulling a chunk off and spitting it on the ground as he paced back. Cooper shook his massive lion head, and blood sprayed. Cooper paced, regaining his breath. He roared at the bloody creature in front of him, glaring as he moved back and forth, matching the movements of the werewolf. Annie watched, breathless with fear. Both sides were bleeding, and neither showed signs of giving up. If Cooper lost, though, that werewolf would force her to the clinic. She already had plans to shift, but she couldn't. Tears streamed down her face. Cooper couldn't lose. This had to end. She looked around for help, but there was none. All the humans had fled, and the shifters only watched, letting the problem handle itself. She returned her attention to the battle in front of her. Cooper and the werewolf had stopped moving and were standing, glaring at each other. Briefly, the idea of stepping between them entered her mind, but she cast it away almost instantly. Both were seriously injured, and it was obvious the two were almost evenly matched. The werewolf shifted back into his human form, and Cooper followed his lead. The werewolf's eyes quickly shifted to Annie and back. He pointed first at Annie, then at Cooper. "Get the hell out of Brazil if you're going to have that abomination. Someone will kill it if you stay here." Eventually, he panted, blood dripping off his face as he spoke. "Come near either of us again, and I'll kill you," Cooper promised. Blood from the wounds on his sides oozed down his leg as he stood staring at the man. The man grinned. "Sure thing." He looked at Annie. "I'll see you." Cooper growled in the back of his throat. The man laughed, shifted, and ran off to nurse his wounds. Cooper remained standing until the man was out of sight, then he collapsed to the ground on his knees. Annie ran to his side. "Cooper! Are you okay?" Annie sat and put her hand on his back. "I'll be fine. I need to shift back so my wounds can heal." A shifter's wounds healed more quickly and efficiently when in animal form. "How close is your hotel?" Annie pointed. "Shift now. There's hardly anyone on the street. We can walk back and go up to my room." Cooper nodded and shifted, releasing a lion groan from his throat. They walked slowly back to the hotel, where they were greeted by the concierge who offered to send up medical supplies. Annie gratefully accepted as they entered the elevator. In the room, Cooper rested on the couch in his lion form, watching as Annie bustled around the room. She got a wet washcloth and drenched it so she could squeeze water into his mouth. After he'd had his fill, she cleaned his wounds gently, which were already scabbing over. "I think you can shift back now," she told him. "You need to shower and wash off the blood." Cooper shifted, and she helped him into the bathroom. He sat on the toilet and waited while she turned the shower on. "Annie?" "I'm in love with you." Annie froze. She turned slowly and looked back at him while the water sloshed over her hand. When it heated up, she jerked her hand out with a yelp. He knelt beside her and took her hand in his. With a goofy grin on his face, he said, "Annie, did you hear me?" She matched his grin. "Of course I heard you. Why do you think I burned my hand?" He glanced down at it. "I think it'll be okay." "Do you have an answer for me?" "I think I'm in love with you too," Annie answered. "Think?" "Well, I'm still mad at you, but the battle you just fought in my honor has gone a long way towards making up for that." Annie rose, pulling him with her. "I'd like to take a shower with you. I'll wash your wounds, and you can rid me of the rest of my anger." She wiggled her eyebrows at him. "I like that idea, my love," Cooper said as his mouth came down on hers. Annie and Cooper had decided to fly home rather than stay in Brazil. After speaking with several shifters in the area, Cooper had deemed it too dangerous there for their child. Several of the shifters were against cross-species, but the werewolves in the area were adamantly against it. They had been accused more than a few times of cross-species disappearances, although nothing had ever been proved. Most cross-species shifters did not stay in Brazil, he had been told more than once. William was born covered in beautiful tan fur much like his father's, but wings, much like his mother's, had sprouted from his back a week after his birth. He looked like a griffin, strong, beautiful, and adorable. Humans and shifters alike in the US fell in love with him. He was the first of his kind, so there was much media coverage at first. But it died down quickly, and the trio was able to live normal lives. Cooper accepted a position teaching at a university, and Annie had decided to stay at home until William was ready for school. They lived near Leah and Mark, and William became Chloe's best friend and would often ride on his back while he flew around the backyard. Life was perfect. The end. The Lion's Cross-Species Baby, by Mary T. Williams. A romancely.com story. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel to get more free paranormal romance audiobooks.